Hello, welcome everyone to the day one of our conference. My name is Payal Agarwal and I thank you all on behalf of the Unicom team for joining us today. I'll start by welcoming and thanking all our speakers and our sponsors, eGain Corporation, Semantic Web Company, Tool Party, and Pure Insights Technology. We are especially excited about this conference because we have come back to one of our favorite topics after almost 20 years. We have gathered stalwart names and globally renowned practitioners from the world of knowledge management. They'll be sharing their ideas and experiences with you and make these 2 days truly worthwhile. We invite and encourage you to put your questions and ideas to the speakers during the Q&A and the panels and make the event interactive. Alongside the conference, there is an exhibition where you can meet technology and solution providers. My colleague will explain in a moment how to access the booths and meet the other participants there. Although this is a virtual event, you can still meet and speak to other delegates in the lounge and by visiting the exhibition. Please continue the discussion on social media via Twitter. The hashtags are in the event guide and are also on the event website. We would hugely appreciate it if you could please complete the feedback form that has been shared with you by email along with the joining instructions. This feedback is valuable to us in shaping future conferences and we thank you for taking the time to give feedback. I'll now hand it over to my colleagues who will start the proceedings. Enjoy the day. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the conference. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to give you a short demo of how to join the different booths at the conference for both days. To the left of your screen, you will see an icon for booths. Once you click on it, you will see the booths of the various sponsors, partners, exhibitors, and organizers for the conference. You can choose to visit any booth of your interest. In order to do that, please click on the option Enter. Once you click on it, you will be directed to this page. To enter the booth, you will need to click on Join Wait Room option. You are now in the waiting room. The booth representative will send you an invite to join the meeting room, which will appear on your screen like this. To join the meeting room, please click on Accept. You are now in the meeting room where you can have one-on-one conversation with sponsor representatives or booth representatives. Thank you.
We at eGain are a digital customer engagement platform. Our solution covers and connects through a full range of digital touchpoints, providing solutions through AI, automation, and knowledge. Then, we optimize it with our analytics and machine learning capabilities. The trends that we see in the market, that you may be seeing as well, are mostly around messaging, virtual assistants, IVR digitalization, knowledge desktops that solve customer queries easily, and finally, analytics for journey and learning. We're rated highly by both our customers as well as analysts. Come try our solution for 30 days, 2 weeks of setup for one of your use cases that we will do for you in our cloud. Then, you can operate the solution for 2 weeks and see it for yourself. At the end, you can decide whether you want to continue or quit. No charge, no catch. That's our offer. Come test us out. We're really excited to meet you. Look for the eGain booth at the show.
Whether you work in the medical field, in financial services, or, well, even if you're planning to build your very own solar plant in the desert somewhere, you'll need data. Lots of it. And once you have it, you need to make sense of it. Until now, that only worked with structured data. You had to collect it from different distributed and not connected databases and put things together piece by piece. That was already a lot of work. But with text-based documents, so-called unstructured data, this task was of even lower precision and so much more complicated. And the ultimate goal, connecting structured and unstructured data, wasn't even possible until now. To fix this, we at Semantic Web Company came up with a solution: Pool Party, a world-class semantic technology suite that automatically enriches your information with valuable metadata and links to your business as well as content assets. What does that mean exactly? Well, let's say you're looking for the best location to build a solar plant. You'll be collecting weather data, information on a country's red tape, political situation, economic factors. How on earth are you supposed to make a valid decision based on all that data? Well, easy. The first step in Pool Party is to build your own taxonomy and knowledge graph specific to your topic. After that, Pool Party connects with your existing system landscape, recognizes and harmonizes the meaning of your digital assets, matches them to the knowledge graph, and then the magic happens. Pool Party tags your data with valuable metadata in order to give you a better understanding of the information you're dealing with. So, that's what happens in the backend. But how do we make all of that user-friendly? Well, Pool Party provides you with handy applications such as analytical dashboards, special topic pages, or semantic search portals. That way, during your research, you already begin to understand connections and trends concerning your topic. On top of that, you can easily visualize and present the information in the form of reports. Sounds intimidating? No need to worry. Pool Party is super user-friendly. That's why its applications can be used by beginners after only a half-day training. Also, it is easily customizable in order to integrate with your existing system landscape. And thanks to our modular pricing model, the use of semantic technologies is no longer limited to large enterprises. Any more questions? Reach out to us and get your personal test account at poolparty.biz/demo.
Hi, my name's Cameron Khan, and I'm the President and CEO of Pure Insights Technology. Here at Pure Insights, we help our customers make enterprise search work just like Google does on the internet. In order to do that, we use the same AI technologies that Google uses. Search, of course, machine learning, and knowledge graphs. And we have three pillars of our business that help us implement our customers' goals. The first is a search consulting practice, which is based on decades of experience that we have. The second is Pure Insights Discovery Platform, which helps us accelerate these implementations. And finally, we have a managed service that we call Search Ops that takes away the headache of managing a search solution on an ongoing basis. So we look forward to seeing you at KM Reborn to continue this conversation.
Welcome everybody, good morning. And we are about to start the 2 days of conference. We have an excellent program lined up. Even if we say so ourselves, it really covers all aspects of knowledge. And as you can't have a knowledge management conference without Dave Snowden, we pulled him out of bed even though he has COVID. And he will start our conference off with narrative forms of knowledge. So over to you, Dave.
Okay, so the idea is to speak probably for about half an hour and leave 10 minutes for questions. That's the plan, right? So, and I can't see anybody, which I absolutely hate because I'm getting no feedback. So apologies if I get any of this wrong. So first of all, knowledge management as a discipline seems to have a sort of Lazarus-like tendency in that it keeps dying and then rising from the grave. And the depressing factor is that every time it comes back again, it makes all the same mistakes of the previous iteration. So it's rather like Groundhog Day, yeah? What I'm hoping is the current loop round will mean people can learn from it. So some of the things that people like me said from day one, and I'll go through some of the negative stuff first, then build on to the positive use of narrative and the way we're moving with that, is when knowledge management got started, which was back in the 1990s, and I came into it from a background in building decision support systems for large companies like Guinness PLC and the like, and how do you better deploy knowledge? And one of the things we were looking at back in the late 80s and 90s is the danger of confusing knowledge with information, and the obsession with codification and writing things down. So there's kind of like a belief, if we haven't written something down, if it isn't codified on a database, it doesn't exist. And I remember back in the 90s, CEO of Hewlett Packard say, our knowledge walks out of the door every night, therefore we got to codify it. And a few of us said, well, why don't you just focus on getting it to walk back in through the door the next day? It might be a lot cheaper and more effective. So some of the themes I'm going to talk about have been around for a long time. And I'll just say now, and come back to if people want any questions, two of the most disastrous frameworks ever used in knowledge management were one, the Narseki model, or what became BAR, with the concept of tacit knowledge becoming explicit. And despite, I think, the Narca's intentions, that became the focus. And the other one was the famous DIKW pyramid, which I think I was the only one who criticized, and now everybody is doing it, which is that fundamentally knowledge is not some higher form of information. From my point of view, knowledge is the means that we inform other people. So if I share a knowledge base with somebody, then the process of communication is more effective. If I don't share that knowledge base, then everything is just data and incomprehensible. Yeah, so my favorite example on that, a whole bunch of figures in a spreadsheet means a huge amount to an accountant and to other accountants, because they share the knowledge of accountancy. Therefore, the data is information. If an accountant is talking with somebody with no accountancy literature, then the data remains data. It never becomes information. So for me, knowledge is the way we convert data into information, and that's kind of like a difference. So that's one point I want to make. The second point is to go back to 3 rules I formulated about knowledge management many years ago in a seminar in Basel. And a lot of my best ideas come when I get very angry with another speaker. So this is where this came from. And there are 3 basic rules of knowledge management, and they've been around for a long time now. One is knowledge can only be volunteered, it can't be conscripted. You can't make people surrender their knowledge because you never know whether they've done it or not. And an example I've been given from years now is when I was in IBM, they told me I had to codify my knowledge on narrative, the thing I'm going to talk about for the bulk of this procedure. Because we'd done pioneering work on it, we were getting contracts with the US government on counterterrorism, it was obviously significant. And so they told me I had to codify it. Well, it wasn't that I didn't want other people to share it, but the main reason for holding things back in companies is generally not power, it's fear of abuse. I don't want everybody grabbing this stuff if they don't know what the hell they're doing with it. That was my concern. So I said, yeah, don't worry, I'll do that next week, and then didn't do it. I found most problems in IBM went away if you said you would do them, then didn't do it, right, in terms of the package. Unfortunately, this time they caught up with me and they made it part of my bonus scheme. So I had to write something on the knowledge management system, which, to be honest, Larry Prusak and I never used. It was too low level of abstraction. So I wrote a paper which was called Narrative Form in Post-Modernist Discourse, which was a fictionalized debate between Deleuze and Habermas, written after 4 or 5 glasses of whiskey late one night. It takes me at least 2 glasses of whiskey to open a book by Habermas in the first place. And I got my bonus because I codified it, but I codified so that nobody else can understand it. But they would actually come and speak with me. And I've seen loads and loads of cases of that, either codifying things in such a way that nobody can really use them, or codifying things in such a way to signal, look, I know something about this, come and talk with me. But the idea that just putting knowledge into an information base will work is actually very, very limited. Yeah. The second one is we only know what we know when we need to know it. Human knowledge is contextually triggered, and that's actually really important. So if you come and ask me a question, it's quite easy in 10 or 15 minutes for me to actually give you knowledge. If you want me to put that knowledge into a database so you can use it without me asking a question, well, I have to spend 4 years writing the book because there are so many things I have to write down, right? So this concept of linking and connecting people and codification in the moment, which is something I'm going to come back to, is key. And one of the things Larry Prusak said, and as a lot of you know, we ran the Institute of Knowledge Management together. If you've got $1 to spend on knowledge management, you spend 1 cent on codification and 99 cents on connecting people. So really, my own work on knowledge management through all the cycles is really focused on how do we connect people so that codification takes place in context rather than the purely abstract. So that's the principle, and I'll come back to that in a second. That actually led me into my first major paper on knowledge management, Complex Acts of Knowing, which is, I think, number 9 in the all-time citation record. So some people have found it useful. Which basically said informal networks are more important than formal systems. And Building informal networks is the way that you handle cross-silo knowledge sharing. So I'm going to come back to that in the sort of three things I want to talk about. The third one was we always know more than we can say. We will always say more than we can write down. And there I'm taking a quote from Polanyi, who said we always know more than we can say, and adding to that saying we always can say more than we can write down. So the process of taking stuff from my head to my mouth to my hands involves an inevitable loss of contents, but principally a massive loss of context. And I would personally estimate, and there's also some research around this, which I've got to re-find at some stage, the most that you can codify of what you know is probably about 5 to 10%. Because most of our knowledge is situated. You've all had that experience of saying, oh, I'll sleep on it, and waking up in the morning with the problem solved. For human beings, sleeping on something is a hugely complex task involving short-term, long-term memory transtraction and chemical changes in the brain to increase abstraction. It's a fascinating process, sleep. I wish I had more of it. On the other hand, if a computer database has gone to sleep, you need to reboot it. It's a whole different process. So that led us into this distinction of three typologies, and I'm definitely avoiding categories. There's a different knowledge management. People need to think more in typology and less in taxonomy. Taxonomy rhymes with taxidermy, and it produces a similar effect. So a typology, perspectives or ways of looking at things, they're not rigid categories. So what I want to talk about is three different types of knowledge and their different relatives importance, and the one that everybody neglects. And I want to use this by way of an example before I put names on it. So one type of knowledge which sort of exemplifies what most knowledge management has actually been about for the last decade or so is a map. And one of the advantages of living in the United Kingdom, although with the way our government is behaving, the advantages are going down exponentially at the moment. Sorry for the political point, but fundamentally, one of the advantages of living in the UK is the whole country is mapped at a very high level of detail. So the whole of the UK is mapped at 9 inches to a mile. So when I go walking, I've actually got three different maps on my iPhone. I've got the 1 to 50,000 and 1 to 25,000 scale Ordnance Survey maps, which have everything. And I've got the 1 to 40,000 scale Harvey's maps, which are perfect for walkers, because if there's a path on a Harvey's map, you know it exists in reality. Where if there's a path on an Ordnance Survey map, it's a right of way, and it may now be a jungle, as I've discovered to my cost on a few occasions. Now, the symbology of maps is actually very powerful. So if anybody's worked with Ordnance Survey maps, you know, if you have a square with a cross on top of it, it means a church with a tower. If you have a circle with a cross on top of it, it means a church with a steeple. There are all sorts of different ways of illustrating ground conditions. There, I can tell the difference between a deciduous forest, a mixed forest. Yeah, the level of symbols which have been developed over the past 150 years of the Ordnance Survey is huge. And symbols allow me to give very, very complex information in a very dense form, so that even on the top of a hill in bad lighting conditions with a compass and a map, I can get off safely. And that's really powerful information. So maps and map users, and this is, I'm now going to use Brasser's phrase, have a very high level of abstraction through the symbols, and language is an abstraction. Yeah, shared language does that, specialist language does it, but symbols are even better. So that carries a high level of abstraction, which allows a significant level of codification. And once you have high abstraction and high codification, then you get high diffusion. Things will spread very quickly and be used. So that's been the aspiration. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the London taxi driver. Now, again, we have this quaint idea within London that taxi drivers should be trained. I was trying to explain this to a group of Americans yesterday, and the idea of training taxi drivers was a strange and alien one. But the way London taxi drivers are trained is they drive around the streets of London for about 2 to 2.5 years. They're called the knowledge boys, by the way, so they need to be taken on by those of us in knowledge management, with a map of London strapped to the handlebar of their motor scooter. And they have to learn the name of every street and about 500 separate routes through London. And the exam is to be given only 2 points in London and describe the route out and the route back, street by street, turn by turn, mentioning every major landmark. It overall has a 40% pass rate over multiple efforts. Nobody's done it in less than 2 years. If any taxi driver claims that, then double check they're charging you properly, because that's the minimum. And once you've got it, it's called the knowledge. And the fascinating thing is the hippocampus of London taxi drivers is significantly larger than other human beings, because the brain has to physically evolve to handle that type of knowledge. And if anybody's worked in apprentice models or military learning, you'll know there's whole bodies of knowledge which require physical change, not just cognitive change. And again, that's been a problem with knowledge management. We've taken a purely cognitive model of processing. We haven't realized the role of the body and social interactions. So certainly whenever I've worked in knowledge management, I often use that example. And instead of asking people a question about tacit and explicit knowledge, I ask them, is this a problem for a map, or is it a problem for a taxi driver? So I'm using metaphor here, which is a narrative form, to get a kind of complex idea in a simple form. And it's not that they're right or wrong, but actually they're different. Right? And that's key. So if you want to compete with a taxi driver, say, so let's suppose you land at Heathrow Airport, you hire a car, and you've got a map, and you're driving across London to the east of London. You will never ever beat the taxi driver, because to use Boyd's OODA loop, which I use a lot on this, you actually have to observe where you are, orientate yourself to the map, decide what you're going to do next, and then act on that decision. And you'll have to stop and go through that cycle several times on the journey. And if you end up at Hyde Park Corner and you're a foreigner, then the game is to try and keep you trapped on the inside of the roundabout for as long as possible. If nobody hasn't played that, go and do it. It's a lot of fun. Right? The taxi driver, on the other hand, is going through that process automatically without thinking about it. And also they can adjust to weak signals. They see a density of traffic. They know that means there's a blockage. Without even thinking about it, they take a different route. So a taxi driver costs you a lot in training, and you can't have many of them, but they're hugely adaptive under pressure, and they can make decisions at speed. Whereas the map is actually less adaptive, but can diffuse to a larger population and can be used without a problem. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. But maps carry their own danger. And I remember, many actual years ago, I got to New York for the first time working with IBM, and I'm Welsh, so if we ever go to a city, we want to find two things: an opera house and a rugby ground. And at that time, New York had 2 opera houses and no rugby grounds, but either way, I got a ticket. And you need to understand the geography now. I'm staying up at Tarrytown, which is north of New York, up the Hudson Valley. An interesting area because the population is a result of 3 generations of inbreeding between IBM and Reader's Digest staff, but we'll leave that on one side for the moment. So I have to get the train in from Tarrytown to New York to do a day's work. And then I have to go to the Opera House, which is north of Grand Central Station. And then reverse that route to go home. And the tickets I got, I was naive in those days. If I'd had tickets in that position in the Royal Opera House in London, I'd need a dinner jacket. So I took my dinner jacket, got the commuter train in wearing the DJ, got laughed at all day by IBM in Park Lane, ended up at the opera that evening, discovered I was the only person in the dinner jacket, so I became a secondary form of attraction. And it was kind of like a wonderful performance of Trovatore, but at the end of it, I went to the cloakroom, picked up my IBM ThinkPad, and in those days they were worth about 10 grand, so they were very expensive, and kind of like realized I had 10 minutes before the next train went north from Grand Central Station. Now, if you know the geography of New York, you know that Lincoln Center to Grand Central is a lot longer than 10 minutes. And I didn't want to hang around Grand Central Station for another hour and a half late at night. So I looked at the map, which was in front of me. And I remembered when we come in from Tarrytown, the stop before Grand Central was called 125th Street. So I'm looking at the subway map, which is right by the entrance to the Lincoln Center, and it says, well, I'm on the red line. So if I hop on the north, remember I'm already north of Grand Central now, get your geography right. If I hop on the red line, I can go about 5 or 6 stops north, get off at 125th Street on the subway, walk across 2 blocks, and get the overground train back. So I've got a really good chance of getting home early. So that's what I do. Now, if I'm telling this story in New York and I tell them it was the 1980s, people have already worked out what's going to happen. And I can tell you in the 1980s, getting off at 125th Street at about 11 o'clock at night with a white skin, wearing a dinner jacket, carrying a £10,000 computer over your shoulder is a really bad idea. And I've been in enough strange cities to walk confidently, but I knew it was only a matter of time before something hit me. And a police car drew up and said, "Buddy, what the hell are you doing here?" And he afterwards told me I'd only survived, for him to rescue me because nobody could believe that anybody could be that stupid. And either way, I was still shaking a bit next day up at Armonk, which is IBM's headquarters. And I sort of told the story. It's an IBM story now, the Mad Welshman on 125th Street. And they said, "Didn't you just know you shouldn't do that?" And I said, "No, the map doesn't say here be muggers and other strange beasts. The map says if I get off here and do this, I can do that." And the problem with highly explicit, highly codified forms of knowledge is precisely that. You have to make so many assumptions about what the user knows that if you get those assumptions wrong, and you're very likely to, because the things which are totally familiar to you, you assume everybody knows, the map can be more dangerous than actually not going there in the first place. So I say, I'm making a case for highly codified, highly abstract knowledge, and a case for the other side as well. Remember, we always know more than we can say more than we can write down. Now, the thing which sits between the two of those is narrative forms of knowledge. And what's fascinating for me, some of my early projects were in civil engineering, working with Lend-Lease out in Australia on the Darling Harbour build and on lessons learned in the big Blue Water development in Kent. And one of the things we found on that was absolutely fascinating. I remember Stuart, who was then the CEO, he said, "The reason you've been brought in is you work with stories, and all engineers tell stories. That's how they communicate." And I thought that was good news because I've thought that for years, but it was nice to find somebody who found it. So we went out and we started to capture stories, and we're always looking for stories of failure. Because failure stories carry far more learning than positive stories. And if you look at naturally occurring stories, people tell stories of failure, not success. Fairy stories, the stories we tell our children, are stories of failure. We have a happy ending, but it's right at the end of the story, because avoidance of failure is something we need to pass on to the next generation. And that's a lesson that knowledge management needs to learn. Worst practice systems have more value than best practice systems in terms of learning. So either way, we're trying to extract these failure stories. And it's the only time it's happened in my career. And we'd start the question, very circumspect. And somebody would say, "Oh, you want my crane story, do you?" And they trot out this story of abject failure in which they cost the company a fortune with a big grin on their face. And it was kind of like, after 2 days of this, I went back to Stuart in the big round building opposite Circular Quay, top floor, and said, "What the hell is this with the crane story?" And I remember he grinned and said, "I wonder if you find that out." So I realized it was a test. And he said, "What happened many years ago is we had a brand new engineer. He'd been trained in Alice Springs by correspondence course, so he'd never seen the ocean before in his life. And he knew about tides in theory, but he didn't know about them in practice. So one night he tied the floating crane to the side of the harbour and left it, and the tide changed and the crane toppled over, and several $1 million of loss. And apparently his supervisor phoned up Stuart, and I said, "I think we should fire this guy, but would you mind seeing him first?" And Stuart said, "Well, I took the guy out for lunch, and by the way, he's now a very, very senior manager in Lend-Lease." And after he told me the story, I realized he'd learned from it, he said. So I basically turned to him and said, "Well, you're now a real engineer because you've lost your first crane." He said, and then I told him exactly what I'd do to him if he ever did it again. And he said, ever since, every time a new engineer comes on board, the whole ritual goes through this whole process, and I have to take somebody else for lunch and go through it. And I thought, you're one clever bastard, because what you've instituted is a ritual about learning through stories of failure. and those stories spread much faster. Now, in the modern day, we've done the same thing with aircraft manufacturers. And the stories that people share are not the story about I clipped my harness on and therefore I didn't have an accident. It's, do you know about Fred? He didn't clip his harness on. He fell off the ladder, but luckily there was somebody underneath him. So his mate broke his leg, but they both lived. Everybody knows that story, and that's a real one. And we won't talk about barrel rolling commercial aircraft under the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge, because we got that one as well, and that was really interesting. So narrative seems to act as this halfway house between the deep expertise of the taxi driver and the highly codified knowledge, of the map user. And so our focus now for 20 or 30 years has been to actually capture knowledge, not in story form, but in what's called micro stories or fragments or anecdotes. I don't have a lot of time, to be honest, for formal storytelling and knowledge management, because storytelling has a double meaning in English, and the dominant meaning is actually quite a negative one. And the reality is that none of us really tell stories, apart from those of us who speak at far too many conferences and we develop the stories. Most of us swap anecdotes, and clusters of anecdotes have more value. So the way we now work on that, let's take the example of, we talk about lessons learning, not lessons learned. Because if people look backwards with the benefit of hindsight, they change how they remember things. And again, IBM project on this. We did lessons learned as a formal process the day before a bid team knew whether they'd won or lost a sale. And we repeated exactly the same process to a script the day after they knew whether they'd won or lost. And it was completely different stories. If the best stories were the ones before where they knew whether they won or lost. But teams who actually won told this lovely logical story, which made them look really good. And teams that lost had all these issues about accidents and bad customers, and it wasn't really their fault. And I subsequently got involved in more of the science of this. And any retrospective exercise, if you capture lessons learned more than an hour or so away from the actual incident of the learning, people change their memories to match the political requirements of the present. So all of this emphasis in knowledge management on lessons learned workshops and retrospectives is actually quite dangerous, because you're capturing the wrong sort of fictional form of knowledge. So what we now do, and this is a Gemba system, if you know the Japanese concept of workforce engagement, is people continuously capture day-to-day observational data. And we also allow them in that to capture what are called micro-anomalies. So these are kind of like something doesn't quite feel right, but it's not serious enough to report it. And those sort of things we actually cluster up and anonymize. And if we get a pattern, take a real case, we can actually get early warning of metal fatigue, for example, in aircraft manufacture. And we can also get early warning of cultural shift or negative attitudes to cybersecurity. All of this is the sort of area of weak signal detection where narrative is really powerful. But also what we're enabling is that that narrative to be available to peer-to-peer. So people can look at more stories like mine and fewer stories like mine, stories which differ from mine. And this has actually been quite major for us in post-COVID, is not actually capturing highly structured retrospectives, but taking people either in the moment to capture data or by replicating it in a game environment to actually capture what I learned as I did things into a quantitative framework, into what's called a narrative database. And narrative databases provide this halfway house between highly structured codified databases. So another couple of examples, then I'll make one final point and open up for questions. So this is a military example. One of the things we deployed with live in Afghanistan is we said to company commanders, if you keep narrative records up to date in the field on patrol, we don't require you to write a patrol report. Now that got us 100% compliance, and it's a lesson about don't ask people to do something which will take their time unless you give them time back there and then, not in the future. It meant we got real-time data from human observers, which meant we could combine it with other forms of sensor data, and we could radically improve what's called an anticipatory trigger about improvised explosive devices. But we also had better data for military intelligence because it was coming in real time. In one of the big telecom companies, we did something similar. So we said to salespeople, you don't have to write sales reports anymore. If you capture a story the day before and the day after every sales visit, that's all we need. From a sales management point of view, that gave much better data. From a sales point of view, it meant they could focus on selling, writing reports. And we're just about to start a series of projects with a big pharma sector on clinical trials. If anybody's interested, this is probably going to be an open project in which we're capturing narrative from patients on clinical trials so we can measure attitudes, feelings, environmental factors, which are traditionally not captured in favor of just physiology. And to give you an example of the importance of this, we've had patients with identical physiological conditions with chronic pulmonary care, but radically different take-ups in oxygen. And we can account for about 90% of the variation of that difference by the way they interpret their experience through stories. So I'm making a really strong case here, and let's say this has been 20 years of my life, is that you really need to start with narrative and then decide what goes where. Because the narrative will tell you things about some things you just need an apprentice model for. There is no substitute for spending 2 or 3 years in a junior role, moving forwards, etc., etc. For some things, well, actually, we got enough stories now. The stories are similar enough that we can create maps. And we also then get into what we call narrative enhanced best practice, or if you're in military, narrative enhanced doctrine, where you have a best practice document, but you have multiple HTML links to actually stories told by people like the people who are going to use it. And they can either use those stories to explain the document, or they can find a story and see it's linked to a best practice document, at which point they're more likely to read it. So kind of like lesson number 1 out of the last few years, and linking from those first 3 principles, is narrative is very important, and it's a damn sight cheaper than traditional codification. It's much more natural for people. They find it easy to do. And this key principle is knowledge management shouldn't be placing a burden on people. They should be taking burdens away, and that has to be now and in real time. The second thing, and one of the things I'm going to do in the workshop tomorrow, is talk about how we use that narrative capture to do something even more sophisticated, which is to map how decisions are made in an organization and identify a forward strategy on knowledge projects. All right, so that's for tomorrow. And that's one of the 3 big things in the EU field guide on managing complexity, which I was the principal author of and which you can all have copies of. The narrative point I've made, but the final point I want to leave you with is informal network management. And that paper I mentioned earlier, Complex Acts of Knowing, is after I joined IBM, and I didn't volunteer, I was conscripted. They bought the company I worked for. I pretty soon realized that the informal networks were far more important than the formal system. And I did a major research project which identified the ratio between one and the other was 1 to 60. So there were 60 informal communities for every formal system. And those were only the ones which actually used the technology. So actually, it was probably even bigger than that. And I still remember going to IBM's chief knowledge officer, who really didn't like Larry Prusak and myself because we got invited to speak and they didn't. And she said, well, how do we make them official then? And I thought, you completely missed the point. They cost us absolutely nothing, but we can stimulate them and get data from them. And that's what the paper talks about. So one of the methods, we developed 2 methods for building informal networks, social network stimulation. One of the most powerful ones is entangled trios. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that use. So in software design now, we put experienced programmer together with bright young kid out of college, together with user trained to talk to IT people. And by the way, it's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than train IT people to understand users. And if anybody wants to know, I can tell you why. And we throw 10 or 15 trios at a problem rather than sending out one systems analyst. So we're introducing more cognitive diversity. But basically, if we run that type of program 2 or 3 times a year for a couple of years, everybody is within 3 degrees of separation of everybody else, which means we focused on creating the channels through which knowledge can flow rather than formally managing the knowledge. So building informal networks across silos, you'll never break down silos because they're attractive, because it's high abstraction, high codification, the cost of sharing information goes down. But building informal networks across silos is really important. And it's not like they don't exist. They're going to exist regardless. It's whether you construct them purposefully or not. So if you take a government example, Singapore government has really dense informal networks amongst its civil servants, and it's very effective. One of the reasons for that is they have national service. So everybody served in the army together and they've mixed across backgrounds. In Britain, our informal networks in government come from 2 or 3 elite schools and 1 elite university, and we can all see the consequences of that. That's the sort of perverse end of it. So if you're going to work in knowledge management, kind of like 3 basic lessons, I think, right? One is start with narrative. Capture the narrative, understand the stories, critically let people interpret their own stories. It's not your role to interpret it, it's theirs. And then decide what becomes highly codified and what needs to go into those abstract, there's low abstraction apprentice models and apprentice schemes. It takes time to acquire. And by the way, that's a prioritization we'll do tomorrow afternoon. If you have a high dependency on taxi drivers, staff retention is a lot more important than if you have a high dependency on maps. And understand that balance is key. Secondly, build informal networks. Before you get into databases and codification and search engines, start to realize in your own organization, if you network and link people very fast, then actually knowledge will flow in the time of crisis or in the time of need. And the third thing, which is we're going to do tomorrow, is understand the reality of how decisions are made in your organization rather than decide how they should be, which finishes me off with what I've always said are the 2 fundamental purposes of knowledge management. One is to improve the decisions which are made, and the second is to create the conditions for innovation or development of new knowledge. There is no other real purpose. Everything else is secondary to that. And with that, sorry, I ran about 5 minutes over intention, but I've left 5 minutes for questions.
We are well within time, Dave, but we haven't had any questions so far. So I would just welcome you to carry on to finish off for the next 5 minutes if you want to.
Give them a second.
Mm.
I reached a natural break point at that point. So.
Okay, naturally, yes, I did understand that you were going to finish off. So I know that there were so many important points you brought about the importance of narrative and informal networking. So it's difficult to just give 5 minutes for those. No, we have no questions yet. Paul Burns says he has no questions. So either we could stop there and hopefully let you get some rest before. Will you be able to join the panel?
Join the panel this afternoon, and we got the workshop tomorrow. Yeah, thanks,
yes,
Paul.
There is just an interesting. Oh no, they're saying, what books do you want to recommend?
I think there are a few classics in knowledge management. You should definitely read Nanaka, but probably the California Management Review article for Barr, but read it with a level of cynicism. Larry Prusak's, Tom Davenport's work in knowledge is still a classic. After that, Patrick Lamb's got a really good one on taxonomy, but too many of the other books follow the classic management textbook approach of let's agree how things should be and find some cases to justify it. So to be honest, I've got more in knowledge management by reading cognitive neuroscience, complexity theory, decision theory. So I would go more into the academic literature about how people really make decisions and learn from that.
We have a lot of appreciations you see there. So.
Yeah, and I know I need to write the book, but somebody needs to give me 3 weeks off without managing the business. So that's another matter.
Okay. that's
to be honest, the blog, if you want to know what I'm thinking, read the blog. Blog is made for me. I love blogging. Tacit, I go with Polanyi. And interestingly, Nanaka didn't get Polanyi right. So Polanyi says no explicit knowledge can exist without a tacit component. So the Nakaseki model is invalid completely, right? So it's not just unspoken. It's, to some extent, it's not able to be articulated. Yeah, it's that sort of, it's like the London taxi driver just knows how to drive across London. If you asked him to describe how he do it, it would probably go wrong. If you want to go to a sports person and ask them to describe what they're doing, they'll start to miss the ball. Yeah. So there's a whole body of stuff in human beings. And by the way, I really want to emphasize this. Too much knowledge management has come from a cognitive view of human consciousness. That's really bad science. We actually know that human consciousness is a distributed function of the brain, the body, and its social interactions. It's not just cognitive. And that's the mistake people make, and that's the mistake people over-focused on computers make in knowledge management. It's also, to come back to this thing from Baz, you need to understand the level of abstraction to make something explicit. I wrote an article on this in the CBI Guide to Knowledge Management called Liberating Knowledge, which was published in 1989, I think. Yeah. And that's key, right? Because it basically says you need to work out what's the upper and lower level of acceptable abstraction. So if I have a conversation with myself, I'm the only audience. If you want me to have a conversation with everybody, then I have to spend weeks, months documenting it. I'll never get it right. So there's this sweet point between the two. And people start with codification. They don't start with that. So in IBM, for example, they had a community of practice for knowledge management. And I went into it and phoned up Larry afterwards because Larry never used it and said, you were right, it's a waste of time. It was a too low level of abstraction for an expert. So I would go there to teach, but not anything else. Yeah. And in terms of taxi drivers be codified, very sorry, but absolutely not. Yeah. The way the physical body brain stores something is not that sort of codification. It's actually as much chemical as it is synapse. So a whole body of knowledge, you can codify an explanation of how it works, but you can't codify the knowledge in such a way that somebody can have that knowledge without going through the same 2.5-year training experience. Intuition, I knew they'd come up with questions sooner or later. Again, I'll go back to Larry. Larry said that intuition is compressed experience, and I've always loved that. Yeah. And by the way, if you ever want to be taken seriously by anybody in cognitive neuroscience, do not say that you've taken Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink seriously, because you won't be asked back to dinner, right? Intuition is actually very bad at an individual level, but it's quite good at a collective level. Gladwell just picks the examples that support his thesis, but that's the way Gladwell writes. And Kahneman does, all right. I mean, again, you need to be careful here. If Kahneman had walked across the corridor to his cognitive neuroscience colleagues 5 years before he did his research, he'd have found that we already knew everything he discovered. Economists never bother to check other disciplines. It's called autonomic and novelty receptive processing. Yeah? And we've done a lot of work, and this is distributed cognition and distributed decision making, on basically making it easier for people to understand intuitive decision making in real time, but critically to find outliers. And if you read the EU Field Guide on Knowledge Management, the EU Field Guide on Crisis Management, you'll find a lot of that described with cases. So I've just put a link in there. If you go onto that site, you can download a virtual copy, or you can get a printed copy sent to you. Any more?
Okay.
No, I think we're there.
No,
Yeah.
no, that's great, Dave. It's absolutely an excellent presentation that has started our day off. Thank you very much, and we'll see you.
It's a pleasure. See you later.
See you later. And let's now go across for Nick Milton's presentation. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. And now to carry on with our program, we have Nick Milton, who will be talking about the status of KM right now and how it's going to change. So, Nick, I won't do any introduction, but if you just take it up from here.
Thank you very much, Dira. I will open my slides. Hang on a second. There we go. Right. I would like to talk about the status of KM in the world and how it's changing. It's 20 years since the last Unicom KM seminar. Has KM changed? Has it evolved? Is it evolving? Has it died? Does it need to be reborn? I'd like to address all of these questions, and I'd like to address them in the light of data, because all of us have our own views, our own opinions, but I'd like to bring some data into the discussion. A brief introduction of myself. I've been working knowledge management now for about 30 years, initially in the oil sector, and then since 1999 as a consultant. I'm based in the UK. I know many of you on the conference today, and it's good to see you all. Those of you who don't know me personally may know the Knowledge Manager's Handbook, which is my most recent book, and it seems to be very popular. Now, I said I'd talk in the context of data, and the data that I'm going to share with you comes from a number of global surveys that I ran since 2014, so that's over the last 8 years. And these are big surveys. They cover all aspects of knowledge management. They had up to 85 questions. And I tried to keep the questions similar year by year so that we can look at trends. In total, we've got over 1,000 responses from knowledge managers around the world. And although there's lots of caveats with the data, it's not quality controlled. I've assumed that people are answering honestly and decently. Anybody who just chose the first option on every page, I've eliminated those. But we've got over 1,000 respondents. And then after the last big survey in 2020, almost immediately COVID hit. So I ran a COVID supplement in 2021 to look at how knowledge management coped with that, because that was the most significant disruption, I think, in knowledge management terms in the last 20 years. So I'm going to look at trends. David has already talked about the two end members of knowledge management, the maps and the taxi drivers, the documented, the undocumented knowledge. And this duality has been with us ever since KM started. On the one hand, you've got the collect model, collecting documents. On the other hand, connecting people. One is about content, one is about conversation. One is about finding knowledge better. The other is about creating better knowledge. One's about structure, search, AI, taxonomy, taxidermy, if you like. The other's more about lesson learning, communities of practice, discussion. I think the one on the left seems to create higher value. I'm not going to share the value results from the survey, but it does seem to correlate with higher value. And then in the middle, we've got some aspects of knowledge management which are a bit of both: best practices, knowledge retention, and as David said, narrative. I've put in there a lot of knowledge retention really is collecting narrative. I'm going to look at trends of the balance of these two and see whether that balance has shifted, A, over the years, and B, within organizations as they become more mature in knowledge management terms. And then I'm also going to look at trends in this other dimension, which is knowledge sharing within teams or knowledge sharing across teams. And I think that is where we're going to see the biggest shift when it comes to COVID lockdown. So here we go. Let's look at some data. The first thing I'm going to do is look at the main strategic approaches to KM. And you can see the columns to the right represent people's ranking of these strategic approaches, and the bigger the number, the more important they think that approach is. I don't expect you to read everything on all of these slides. What I'd like you to see on this slide is everything that has got a value greater than 9, so that's really highly ranked, is consistent. There are a top 5 strategic approaches to KM which have remained consistent throughout the past 8 years. Now, there's been a little bit of a shift. You can see, for example, connecting people through communities and networks. That's dropped from first place to third. Learning from experience has dropped from joint first place to 5th. Is that a real trend? I don't know. It could be just inaccuracies in the data. But the main point here is that KM has been trying to do the same thing for the past 8 years. There's been no big shift. Looking at the same data, looking at the main strategic approaches, I then looked at what was people's first choice. First choice, not just ranking, but first choice. Who gave it 10 out of 10? And here I'd like you to look at the blue segment right at the bottom. Now, there's a bit of a caveat here, because in the 2 later surveys, the middle bar and the right-hand bar, let me just switch on the laser pointer so you can see what I mean. I'm looking at this bit down here, and this is the people whose first choice strategic approach was connecting people through communities and networks. What Larry Prusak would have spent 98 of his cents on if he had $1. What David was talking about as the informal network approach seems to be dropping in popularity. If that's real, and it sort of looks real, it's a big shift between 2017 and 2020, then perhaps KM as an industry is moving more towards the documents and further away from the people. I think if that's true, that's a bit of a worry. Let's look at some other trends. Here, again, don't look at everything, look at the heights of the bars. And in each case, the blue bar is 2014 survey, 2017 survey in the middle, 2020 on the right. Left-hand graph, KM team size. There's no real consistent big shift here between those bars. Ranking of KM team skills, there's no shift there really in those bars. The low ones stay low, the high ones stay high. Not much of a change there, not much of a trend. Let's look at the barriers to KM. Again, this is a ranking, and the highest rank ones in 2014 are the same as the highest rank ones in 2020. Lack of leadership support is consistently the greatest challenge. Insufficient technology is consistently the least challenge. So no great change here in the environment within which KM is operating. Let's look at technologies. Again, I'm not expecting you to read everything on this slide, but along the bottom, we've got a set of technology functionalities, and then we can see the 3 bars. Blue 2014, red 2017, green 2020. The high ones stay high, the low ones stay low. There's no big shift in knowledge management technology functionality. Yes, there's a shift in tools. Yes, there are some tools coming in, which we've not had before. There are, you can see maybe blogs are becoming less used. Maybe microblogs are becoming more used, but these are little tweaks. I think on the whole, we're looking at a picture of stability over time. The same with KM processes. What was high in 2014 stays high in 2020. What was low in 2014 stays low in 2020. Not much of a change. The picture I'm giving you here is of an industry that is relatively stable over time. I don't think knowledge management has shifted very much since 2014. With one exception, and I'll give you the caveats on this exception in a moment, and that's annual KM budgets. And there we do see a trend over time. Now, average budgets are going to be strongly influenced by the biggest organizations. Therefore, we only have to lose a couple of big dinosaurs. We only have to lose an IBM or a Shell or something from the survey to see these budgets drop. But I'm not sure that's the only story, because we can see the budget is consistently higher for bigger organizations, as you might expect, but that drops between 2014 to 2017 to 2020, even though, as the graph on the right shows, consistently in every survey, 70% of respondents say that KM is increasingly being seen as important, and yet we're seeing the budgets drop. Why that's happening, I really don't know, but I'll come back a little bit later to what we might be able to do about it. Now, those are trends over time, trends in the responses of people to consistent questions, consistent survey questions over time. And we can't see many trends. I think it's a picture of stability other than in budgets. But let's look now at trends in knowledge management maturity. Let's look at how mature KM organizations differ from those which are getting started. And here I think we can see trends. Now, in the surveys, we approached maturity in two ways. We said, how many years have you been doing KM? And also, how would you describe the status? And the three bars on the bar chart to the right are, we're in the early stages, we're well in progress, KM is embedded. And consistently on each of the surveys, we got about 40%, 40%, 20% from early stages, well in progress, KM embedded. If we cross-correlate these two graphs, we can see how long knowledge management actually takes. So down here, organizations in the early stages of knowledge management have been doing it about 3.5 years. So after 3.5 years, you're still in the early stage. Organizations that say they're well in progress are 7, 8, 9 years they've been doing KM, and they're well in progress. Organizations that have it fully embedded, somewhere between 10 and 14 years. So that reinforces what we've already known. I think KM it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's about change. It's about culture change. So as people go through that decade-long journey, what changes? A little bit more background first, because I think we also need to acknowledge different organizations are at different places. The picture on the left here, where green, KM is embedded, yellow, well in progress, red, early stages. This is plotted against organizational size, and you can see that for the largest organizations are the ones with the most green and the least red. The smallest organizations have got the most red and the least green. So the most mature KM organizations are the big ones. It was a big company game for a long time. The horizontal bar chart on the right looks at industry sector, and we can see legal, oil and gas, construction and engineering have got most green and least red. Down at the bottom, we've got education and training, the universities, the retail trade, manufacturing. So as we look at our trends with maturity, we do have to remember that the mature ones are the big ones, and they're the oil sector, there's construction, and also legal. So now let's look at some trends with KM maturity. The first one, almost a cross-check really, is to look at the degree of KM integration with maturity. And as you go along to the right here, you can see less and less organizations where KM is being addressed by a separate group, less and less organizations where KM is a one-off or non-routine, and more organizations where KM is fully integrated, a routine part of normal organizational operational work. That's what you would expect, and that's good to see, and that's great. Here's another one, which was perhaps maybe a little bit more surprising. The number of cultural barriers. We asked people to identify a whole series of cultural barriers and which ones were important. And the number of barriers they identified is a sort of proxy for the complexity of the cultural challenge they face. And as organizations become more mature in KM, the number of cultural barriers comes down. Correlation is not causation. It's not necessarily KM that's dropping the barriers. It may be that when the barriers are low, KM is easier to become mature. Or it could be that KM itself is a culture change agent, and the more you do it, the more the cultural barriers fall. I think that's my preferred interpretation. Let's go to the document end. Let's go to the David Snowden's maps. Let's go to the documented knowledge. How do you treat documented knowledge as KM becomes more and more mature? In the early stages, we see a lot of green, which is where documented knowledge is scattered across many stores. As KM matures, those stores are tidied up, and instead we have documented knowledge collected in one or more stores and tagged. But we also see curation coming in, this purple sector here. We also see at the top, in addition to collection of documents, the knowledge within those documents is synthesized. It's taken out of the documents and used to build something like narrative, like best current practice, like guidance, like wiki content. And this is where I think this is where a lot of the value lies. This is where knowledge becomes liberated from a fixed document and becomes something that can grow and mature. Now, I do have to say, with all of these trends over time, these are not set in stone. You do not have to move towards synthesis of knowledge after 10 years. You can start with that. This is just patterns that we observe. And for example, here's another set of patterns, and this is looking at some of the more tacit ends, the more connecting ends, the more human-to-human ends of knowledge management, such as the discussion and derivation of best practice, lesson learning, or communities of practice, knowledge retention. As organizations become mature, more and more of them, or a larger and larger percentage of them, use these, let's call them more tacit elements. Why not use them from the start? Well, I think there seems to be a trend that organizations start with the documents and then rediscover the importance of people. And that's not inevitable. You don't have to do that. You can start with acknowledging the importance of people, acknowledging the importance of communities and connecting. But somehow it seems to happen more as a progression, more of a trend with maturity. Here's another chart that shows the same thing, and this is looking at these tacit elements, but looking at the satisfaction rating that people give them. Satisfaction rating between 1 and 5, and the more mature an organization becomes, the more happy they are with their best practice, with their lesson learning, with their communities of practice, with their knowledge retention. I think this is a rediscovery, almost. It's almost as if organizations have to go through this rediscovery process themselves. And we see quite often, a couple of weeks ago, Deloitte, for example, saying there is a new knowledge management. The new knowledge management is not about documents. It's about providing the best knowledge so people can make a decision. And my immediate thought was it never was just about documents. It's always been that balance between content and conversation. But I think Deloitte discovered for themselves, as KM matured, that it's not just about documents. There was another one, I think it was KMI this morning, saying knowledge management is not just about collections of content. It's about drawing on the collective knowledge of the organization to empower people to make better decisions. To which several people responded. This was on Twitter, I think. Several people responded, well, wasn't it always about that? Well, yes, it was. But maybe KMI have just come to that realization. So with maturity comes a shift, and the shift is away from the documents alone and towards a more balanced KM with the documents and the people, connecting and collecting. So this was my observations up until 2020. And then, of course, the world changed and we entered lockdown. Stay at home, protect the health service, save lives. Not only did we enter lockdown, we entered recession. My first question was, will KM survive this at all? Because generally, when organizations are in trouble, things like knowledge management are the first to go. So I sent out this supplementary survey. And the first thing I asked was, has KM continued? The pie chart on the left, red says KM has continued much the same. Blue says KM has expanded. Now, I didn't expect that. Why would COVID expand KM? We can see that even if it does expand, that the budget didn't expand with it. And in fact, even if KM remained the same, quite often the budget was decreased. But KM found a bigger role in lockdown. Was it harder? Was it easier? The blue sector, 34% said harder. The red sector, 31% said easier. The green sector, 35% said much the same. So there's a bit of a balance there. Some things were easier, some things were harder. What was harder was the lack of face-to-face, the lack of that sort of ad hoc meeting, the meetings in the hallways around the water cooler. Easier was that suddenly people saw the value. By separating people from their colleagues, it created a demand for knowledge and a demand for knowledge management, and therefore a greater level of management support. So what was KM doing during lockdown? Well, yes, here we go. KM didn't change, it did change its scope. It added things like collaboration. KM became much more of a support for remote working, a support for use of video conference tools, a support for digital transformation. There was some expansion within the organization, some delivery and facilitation of online events, and we removed the face-to-face events and the training courses. KM became, to a large extent, a supporter of online work. Now, I'm going to show you some results of another survey now, and just to see what sort of online work we're talking about. This is a published article. It's from Nature Human Behavior in 2022, and it's a study of thousands of people in Microsoft, a study of their collaboration and communication patterns both before and during lockdown. And these little looks like blue flies here on the chart. The further they move to the left, the more this type of behavior, the behavior they represent, the more that decreased. So we can see the blue flies clustering around the 0 are the number of ties people have. That's the number of people they speak to, the number of groups. What are the ones that were suffering? Share of time with cross-group ties, people in other groups. They're not spending time with bridging ties, people who bridge one group and another. They're not spending time with the weak ties, the people who aren't in their team. What we're seeing, and this is coming out of many studies now, there's a big HBR article on it right now. We're seeing during remote work an increased silo behavior. The teams become stronger, but sharing across teams is becoming much less of a pattern. Here's some, on the left, there's some conclusions from the Nature Human Behavior article. Previous research suggests these changes in collaboration patterns may impede the transfer of knowledge and reduce the quality of workers' output. Yeah, because people are stuck in their teams, the team silos are strengthened, they're delivering work, they're working efficiently, but nothing new is coming in from other teams. Interesting. Okay, my time's nearly up. I'm going to share some one conclusions and one recommendation slide. The conclusions are, we see trends in knowledge management, not so much over time, but as organizations mature. KM remains the same mix of the same top 5 strategies, but potentially attention to connecting people through communities and networks, potentially that's slipping away a little bit. Is the KM balance shifting over time a bit from conversation to content? And while many things remain the same, it seems the budget is dropping. That should worry all of us, I think. However, as knowledge management matures, organizations seem to rediscover that conversational KM, and they seem to shift back from content to conversation. As I've said, this is not inevitable. You don't have to do that. I would much rather see a balanced approach throughout. But that doesn't seem to be the way people do it. Now, the remote working, and this will carry on into hybrid working, has raised the profile of KM, but it's added other barriers, and that main barrier is the team silos have been considerably strengthened, which is exactly the sort of thing communities of practice and networks, informal networks, would fix. Maybe it's time to bring those back in. So what next? As we go into the post-COVID world, we're not in the post-COVID world. David Snowden has it, and so do many, 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 many people. We're not in the post-COVID world, but what do we face as knowledge managers as we make that transition back into work? Well, I think we are at a tipping point, and we can make a choice here. We've got an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is that KM has proved its worth during COVID. The challenge is that it's shifted into a more siloed role, that role of supporting team collaboration. So I think it is our opportunity to build on the kudos that we've gained and become more strategic, to look at the critical knowledge of the organization and how that can be better managed and mobilized to demonstrate more value and therefore get more budget, please, to be more intentional. We can no longer rely on ad hoc meetings by water coolers. We've got to be more intentional about the cross-team meetings. We need to be intentional about how we break the silos. We can't rely on accidents. We need to restore the communities of practice, those informal networks, and the more formal communities. And we need to address that undocumented knowledge as well as what's in the documents. Those are my conclusions. Those are my recommendations. And I'm very happy at this stage to take questions.
Loads of questions, Nick. So if you want to go down from the top.
Okay, well, I can see a question. Could budget be dropping as the technology becomes cheaper and there is a focus on platforms over people? Well, that could be, but there didn't seem to be much of a drop in the size of KM teams. So I'm not sure that is right. It could be linked to putting your faith in technology, and technology will work almost always more with the documented knowledge than the undocumented. So it could be linked to that shift. The move towards content and away from community may be in the context of the emergence of big data and AI. It may be, Robert. It may be. I didn't find big data and AI ranked very highly on people's priorities. It wasn't in the top 5. I think it's something that is more there in theory than in practice at the moment. It may be that if I was to do the survey again over the next 5 years, maybe we see more people doing AI, but I don't think they're doing it yet. I do agree with you that we suffer a lot of document automation being labeled as KM. And I do agree with you that some organizations may get stuck in the early stages. And I think there's quite a few that got into the early stages and then got stuck and dropped off and gave up. Baz is saying, I would classify best practice and lesson learned as documents. Well, Baz, I would say you've got to get the knowledge from the people. It doesn't have to be documents. People can share lessons through conversations. Once a lesson is documented, yes. Once a best practice is documented, yes. But once a best practice becomes a document, it goes out of date immediately. I think the ideal home for a best practice is in something that will evolve over time, such as a wiki. So I think best practice, I had that in the middle between the two end members. Lesson learned, I had that more on the left-hand side because I think the most important thing there is actually identifying what that lesson is. David was making the case for micro-narrative, which is the sort of thing that comes out of after-action review. And for me, that's a people process. And lesson learning is a people process. It's people getting around and discussing. And very often the document is a tag that a lesson exists. And the first thing that people do is pick up the phone and talk to the originator. So I've just agreed with Kim in her comment. In my experience, this is Janine. Hi, Janine. When organizations discover for themselves the realization that KM is chiefly about people, that's when KM really takes hold. I think that's right. I don't know why people tend to enter KM at the document end and then rediscover the people bit. I really think they're wasting their time in the early years. I would love to see it more as a holistic, more of as a balanced thing from the beginning. And this is Janine again. I'm concerned that the world of modern work is networked. We've learned in networks, yet our profession is moving away from something so fundamental. Yeah, agree, Janine. And particularly in a hybrid and remote working world, where the last thing you want is more Zoom meetings. And the Zoom meetings that you've prioritized are the ones with your team because you need to get the work done. And the ones that you don't prioritize are the ones with your networks. That's something we need to think about as we go forward. And that's something we need to become much more intentional about. How do we revitalize those networks? Do you know why the maturity of KM in the education sector's universities is so low? Jeremy, I don't. I really don't. I see these figures. They come out of the survey. They are true. They must be true because they represent people's opinions. But I don't always know the why behind them. It's an observation rather than anything else. What about transfer of knowledge between COVID and post-COVID times? That would be interesting, wouldn't it? I think lots of organizations learned some interesting things during COVID. And in fact, probably those who demonstrated their value the most were the ones who developed good practice in dealing with COVID and solving the problem. I think in the post-COVID world, there is one thing that every organization faces, and they're doing it for the first time, and that is a post-pandemic return to work. So I think that's something that KM programs could focus on. How do we build the knowledge of returning to work so we can do that efficiently and effectively? That's not really transferring between COVID and post-COVID, but actually looking at the transition. How are we doing, Gira?
We're doing okay. Just got a few more minutes to spare, so
Okay, well, I've got a few more questions to
questions
answer.
to go through also. So
Yeah,
let's.
yeah. So Razwan Alam is asking, any budget threshold or range for KM? It depends on the organization, but there does seem to be a de facto minimum KM team size, which seems to be about 3 people. Obviously, if you're an organization of 4 people, you're not going to have 3 of them on KM. But if you're, 100 people or more, your KM team should probably be about 3. So 3 people budget. There's your threshold. Can you give some tips that would foster KM adoption? Prikawal Singh, that's another talk. that's probably another conference. But I would say prove the value. Start small. Solve some problems. Focus KM on problem solving and prove the value, because both your management and your staff will be thinking, what is this KM? Is it really helpful? So if you can do some small pilot studies that solve a business problem through knowledge, then that's your best advertisement. Do you plan to explore in the future how small companies deal with KM? Dan, hi Dan. That's a good question. I mean, I've got a small company and we deal with KM and we have our own knowledge base. We have our own community software. We have, it's very lean and very simple. So I think the principles are the same. It's just the complexity scales to a much greater extent when you have multiple countries, multiple divisions, multiple languages, multiple cultures. So I hadn't planned on exploring it, but I think that's a very good question. Could the increase of online collaboration platforms result in more meaningless conversations as opposed to meaningful ones? Quite possibly, Paul. It depends how you, like everything, it depends how you use that technology. And I think if we are to break the silos that we see in hybrid and remote working, then we need the technologies that break the silos. But you've got to ask yourself, what are those networks talking about? And if you can define your collaboration communities based on a topic, and the topic is often practice, but it could be product, it could even be customer, then it gives people an avenue to reach out to others in other teams. And that will cut down on these meaningless conversations. I think you're right. We've got to eliminate the noise and increase the signal. And we do that by being, as I said, more intentional. Baz says, thank you. Thank you, Baz. Maybe there's been a shift in spend from KM budgets to IT budgets. You could be right, Fiona. You could well be right. But as I said earlier, the KM teams don't seem to be getting any smaller. I can't quite work that one out, how the teams remain the same and the budget drops. But yes, you may be right. How do you capture all of the informal knowledge and ethics of capturing informal and maybe more frank conversations that people didn't want to share? If people don't want to share, Alia, then you won't capture it anyway. But I think you give people a safe place to share. And that's where you get the frank conversations with closed doors and no blame process. There's plenty of no blame processes in KM that you can use: the after action review, the retrospective, the peer assist. You can never capture all of the informal knowledge. As David was saying, you capture it in context. And that's very often in context of the need. So if somebody needs knowledge, others will share their knowledge in that context. And generally, people do not hold back. If there is a colleague that really needs your knowledge, you will share. Can we differentiate between returning to the office and returning to work? Yes, we can, Kim.
Sorry, Nick, can I
think we're
interrupt?
running out of time.
We're running out of time, and this question is very apt for our panel session. which you will be moderating anyway. So
I will be moderating, yeah.
Can we take that across there?
Yeah, hold fire, Kim. We'll address that later.
Yes, please. And we'll take the questions across because we are really right on time for the next presentation that is going to be given by Robin from Microsoft. So thank you. That was a very informative talk. And of course, the questions show how good it was. And we'll talk to you in at the panel, of course. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending my session. Hopefully, it will be time well spent for you. My name is Robin, and I am the Creative Director for Modern Work within Microsoft Industry Solutions. And as such, I lead a product management team, if you will. And we've been using KM plus innovation processes to really create great work for our customers and internal stakeholders. And that's really what this session is all about. The key thing we've been trying to do is combine and intersect the disciplines of KM and innovation to realize business strategy. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. Is we'll start with providing an overview of what we believe the KM model building blocks are. I'll talk to you about how Microsoft increased innovation outcomes using this KM model approach. And then we'll also talk a little bit about how you can get started in your organization. But as I was preparing for this presentation, I really got to thinking and reflecting on the fact that knowledge really is the lifeblood in most of what we do as humans. I mean, every day, millions of us across this planet depend on knowledge to work, play, and learn. It really is a key part of being human and the evolution of our species and the history per se. However, it's very ironic then when I think about the fact that many stakeholders in the organizations that we drive knowledge management for still don't feel that many of these KM programs yield as much business impact or contribute to as much organizational innovation as those companies or stakeholders would like. That's not to say that KM programs don't deliver value. They clearly do. It's just reflecting brought me to the conclusion that there's still perception amongst many stakeholders that the value isn't quite as high as it could be. And I think some of the reasons for this are very obvious. Things like maybe not having a KM strategy, maybe not managing your stakeholders properly, maybe not having capabilities in the right areas. However, what we discovered in our journey over the last few years is that there are many, many blind spots, things to which we are not aware of that negatively impact on the overall value of our KM programs. Taking this theme of blind spots a bit further, I mean, it's very similar to creating a fantastic meal or an average poor meal. I mean, the first thing you've got to know, you've got to really understand what are all of the key ingredients you need to make this great meal. If you miss out any of those key ingredients, if you have a blind spot to maybe the sugar or the fruit, that pie you're going to bake is not going to be a fantastic thing. So the first thing is really understanding, what are all of the key ingredients we need to make this great meal? And then the second part of that is really, what is the process you use to combine all of those ingredients to make sure that the cooking process is the right thing, to use those ingredients properly and to really create an amazing meal. Now that's really what this presentation is all about right up front. It's that I think the key to consistently creating high business impact and contribution to organizational innovation is to be able to see and use all of the key KM ingredients and building blocks that should be working in harmony to deliver real value and innovation. And those 9 building blocks are actually evidence in what we call the KM model canvas. Those are all of the KM ingredients that we need to work with and should be working with in harmony. And then the process of designing one for your own organization, creating something very specific for you, is really the cooking process, which in this instance is a design thinking process. What we're going to do today, though, is we're going to spend more time talking about the canvas and these 9 ingredients. We won't spend as much time talking about the actual process you go through to create one. That you can follow up with me afterwards to learn more about. So, in summary, or in introduction, what is a KM model? Effectively, it's very similar to a business model, but focused on KM. A KM model basically describes the rationale for how your KM program creates, delivers, and captures value for an organization. You can use a KM model to basically assess your current state. You can use it to design a new KM model, and you can use it to communicate the current KM model that you have in place. And once again, a KM model is represented by 9 interconnected building blocks that represent the entire KM universe you should be considering that need to work together to drive maximum impact in your organization. Now what I'm going to do, I'll actually walk you through this KM model canvas. This canvas has been inspired by the company Strategizer, who build business models or talk about business models. We've adapted it for KM. So the first key thing you've got to do when you're trying to create optimum value through KM is to clearly understand who are the key people, the archetypes, and their specific KM needs that business is enabled by. Who are these people and what do they need? That's the first key thing to really understand. The next key thing is to then consider everything you've learned about those archetypes and their specific business needs, and then to really dig into what are the KM services and solutions that we need to create that map back to each of those different personas and actually satisfy tangibly their needs and help solve their problems. So that's a one-to-one mapping. You first unpack who your personas are, the people you're serving through KM, what it is they need from KM, and then you frame the key services and solutions that map very specifically back to each one of those persona groups. Then the next key thing to look at, you know who you're creating value for, you know what you're going to provide them. Now you really need to look carefully at how am I going to get those services to those various persona groups. And here's an example of self-service. Once you've figured out how you're going to deliver those services to those individuals, the next key thing you've got to look at is how are you going to stay close to those persona groups? How are you going to stay close to your users so that you can recognize over time how their needs change? Because your needs today are probably very different to what they were maybe 18 months ago. So you've got to put relationship management in place to really help drive awareness for the KM services you're providing, but at the same time, stay close to those personas so that you can see how their needs change and thereby iterate the services you provide over time. Once you've understood these 4 key things, all of which are interconnected, as you can see, the next key thing one of the most important key things is to then focus on how are you going to drive value realization from those KM services to those KM personas that have been defined. And here there's really three key things that we typically look at. The first is understanding what value represents at a very granular level so that you can actually measure or put metrics in place for your KM solutions and services that map directly back to what the users perceive as value. Then the other key thing you've also got to be able to do is to help your end users be in a position to actually fully consume and use and become proficient in the services that you offer them. If they don't know how to use those services or where to find them, you're not going to get the value. And then the last piece of that puzzle there is all about culture and behavior, behavior levers and rewards. And that requires you to then look very carefully and diligently at how are you going to drive culture change and how are you going to reward people for the behaviors that your model requires to deliver value. So these are the 5 key things in the front stage that directly face your end users. Now we're going to talk about the backstage, kind of the engine room that has to be in sync to provide those front stage services. And the first key thing you've got to look at here is, well, to provide these 5 other elements, what are the most important KM activities we need to have in place to provide that? And that may be the ability to design KM strategy, the ability to define KM processes, the ability to drive change management. What are the key activities you're going to have, or the key competencies you're going to have in place to provide for those other 5 areas? And then once you've done that, you're then in a position to really look closely at what are the resources we're going to need to provide for the rest of this. So what kind of intellectual resources do we need? What kind of financial resources do we need in terms of digital platform, etc. So you've got to understand what are the most important resources that you've got to have in place to make the rest of this model work. Then once you've done that, you have to then recognize, like many, many companies, when providing internal KM programs, is that you don't have all of the resources at your disposal to do all of this yourself. So what you need to be able to do then is think strategically about identifying and securing partners to help you do certain parts of this, because you simply can't do it yourself. So as an example, you may need an executive sponsor to sponsor your KM program, to role model behaviors. You may need a company like APQC who designs KM strategy to help you define your strategy. And you may even need a company like Microsoft to help you with your digital platform. So you need to look carefully at who are the partners you need to work with to help you deliver on the promise of your KM model. And then the last key thing here, you also need to really understand what are the funding models you're going to need to have in place to be able to pay for this entire model. And hopefully that funding is outweighed by the value that your model provides back. So these are the 9 interconnected building blocks that have to work in unison for your KM model, for your KM initiative to deliver maximum value back to your business. So as you can see, it is a visual blueprint to help challenge your current thinking and to help you innovate your current approach to doing KM programs for your organization. The interesting thing to call out right up front is that KM strategy is all about where you want to go and what you want to achieve with KM. So having a KM strategy is very important, and putting a KM model in place does not replace that. What a KM model does for you, as you can hopefully see, is it helps you define a tangible approach on how you're actually going to get there, how you're going to achieve your KM strategy. It's really your operational blueprint, if you will, for achieving that vision that you've set out with your business. Another interesting thing to focus on is that you can apply KM model innovation at any level of your organization. You can apply it at the corporate level, you can do so at a business unit level, you can do it functionally, and you can even do it at a specific project or team initiative. It works at all levels of the organization. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk to you, provide just a little bit of a story of how we at Microsoft use this KM model innovation approach to help us actually drive better innovation outcomes. And Microsoft, like all businesses, like your business, really recognizes that our survival absolutely depends on constantly innovating. So we are like relentless about looking for ways to continually generate more innovation. And what we recognized about 4 years ago, about 3 years ago, should I say, in our area of the business, it was an epiphany. You know, only 2% of us are paid to create products and services for a living. You know, in R&D and product development, only 2% of us. And the rest of the organization, the other 98%, were essentially paid, you know, to deliver those products and services, to do marketing, you know, HR, finance, etc., etc. But what we really realized is that that another 98% really were truly untapped creative potential for identifying things that might be their next big hit. What we decided to do is come up with a new business goal around innovation, around grassroots innovation. And the purpose of this, the business purpose, was to really drive business growth through enabling any employee to invent what's next. And we were super excited about this new opportunity that we'd identified. However, after 18 months running this grassroots innovation program, we quickly realized that we weren't really having enough tangible business impact. We had limited innovation outcomes. We had people submitting ideas, but turning those ideas into things that people wanted didn't really prove to be that successful. And what we determined when we analyzed these outcomes was that, you know, a big part of this, a big issue here, is inefficient knowledge management. So what we decided to do is use KM model innovation, use this KM model, use this approach that I'm talking about, with the goal of enabling all of these grassroots innovators with the right knowledge at the right time to improve these innovation outcomes. And what I'll talk you through now is our specific KM model that we came up with to improve these innovation outcomes, and I'll also share the outcomes that we've basically received. Now, so back to that 9-block model, the first key thing that we focused on when we're looking at all of this was really getting clear about who the personas were. And already we defined a couple of blind spots right up front when we went through this process. You know, the first is when we were looking at the innovators and understanding them better. These are any average Joe that wanted to submit an idea. What we discovered about them is that because they came from all different parts of the business, not all of them knew how to fully develop the ideas. They have a great idea, but they don't know how to fully develop it. I have an idea for an amazing rocket ship, but I myself certainly don't have the skills to build out a prototype rocket ship. So we discovered something very important there, that there was gaps in knowledge between what the innovators wanted to do and their capability to do it. The next key thing we discovered was an entirely under or overlooked group called the contributors. These were people we identified, there were hundreds of them, who didn't have their own idea, but really wanted to help other people develop their ideas and wanted to contribute their expertise. So that was one group we had completely overlooked. And then the third group, our management, our leadership team, we'd automatically assumed that they would have the knowledge to assess the impact of potential ideas. But what we discovered is because we use a cross-section of leadership across the company, many of them aren't experts in the technologies that people were providing ideas for. So they too really struggled. They told us to evaluate properly the ideas being submitted. And then there was another group that we completely overlooked, And these are the folks at the other end of the spectrum who would like to use the innovations coming out of the program. What they were telling us is, I love your ideas, but I don't know what to do with any of this. So we'd already discovered some major blind spots by having a close look at the personas using this program and benefiting from it. The next key thing we were able to then do was take this knowledge that we just gained and define an updated and optimized set of innovation services using knowledge management as the baseline here. So the first key thing that we did for our innovators, because we knew they didn't have the skills to fully incubate the ideas, is we created a learning path. So we took the tacit knowledge from innovation experts, we put that into an explicit learning path, and we also provided additional coaching so that now anybody could sign up and go through this learning path and get guided step by step how to go from idea to prototype. The next key thing we added, because now we knew that was a need, is the ability for these innovators to recruit people to their innovation projects. So they could specify the skills they were looking for help with. And then from the contributor standpoint, we updated our ideas app to allow them to search and view all of the ideas being submitted, and to also then obviously discuss and add their own explicit knowledge in the form of attachments and videos and things like that. What we did for our management team is we got together with some of our distinguished engineers and we packaged their impact assessment criteria into an automated process, and then we also paired these managers with technical experts to help them very quickly assess the full impact of an idea. What we also did for the folks who were going to use these innovations, we created a standard structured format that all ideas that were being funded would be put into. So we created a standard structured format representing a solution and how to use those solutions. We made it easy for them to basically use what was coming out of this. So now that we'd already gotten to this point and we're already plugging some of these blind spots, the other key thing that we looked at was, very importantly, how do we make it easy for all of these various persona groups to get access to these KM innovation services and to be able to use them really easily. So for us, our decision point was to create a Teams app that combined all of these features and providing a hidden channel in that team for the management to discuss and make their decisions, and then to add to that a document library so that all of the consumers from around the company could browse the innovations coming out of this program and use them. So that was our service delivery strategy, to make it easy for people to find and use what was coming out of this particular program. Very importantly, though, we recognize that everyone's needs change over time. So to make sure that we kept abreast of the changing needs of the personas, we essentially put a number of relationships in place to help us keep abreast of changing needs, to communicate changes in the services, and to also embed feedback in the design of new services. So we put a coaching service in place to enable the innovators and contributors to get a guided walkthrough of how to innovate. We put an innovation community in place with community leads as a forum for all of these different groups to discuss innovation and to share broader ideas. We put IP forums in place as a place that experts would be able to answer questions on the innovations that they produced. And we also put program management into place to ensure that all of the ideas submitted went through the right process, and eventually some of them ended up in shipping innovations. So we had to have relationship management in place to keep our ability to iterate and to understand and to meet KM personas' needs in play. Then what we focused on is really deeply looking at how we were going to get value out of the promises these KM services made to these KM personas. And for us, what we did is we defined a set of metrics that represented success to us, which was more innovation. And those metrics were used and instrument it against those various KM services. So we were able to measure how many ideas were being submitted, what the sentiment analysis of those ideas were, how our subject matter, how our SME network was growing, how many people were going through these learning paths, how many people were actually submitting and contributing to new ideas, and how many of these ideas actually turned into things that shipped and were used by other customers and stakeholders. Then the next key thing we also did was put some change management, adoption and change management in place, primarily to help people better use these apps that I've talked about. And definitely we used executive sponsors to provide money and opportunities for recognition to encourage the right behavior. And that made a massive difference. Some of this we were not doing before we were looking at this KM model. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the backstage, the engine room that you need to have in place to service that front area. And here for us, one of the key things that we needed to do was to define a set of knowledge services, design, should I say, a set of knowledge services and the associated knowledge transfer processes through each of those different apps so that the knowledge transfer process actually did take place, that we went from the ability to submit an idea, to combine that tacit knowledge with other people's explicit knowledge, and then to turn that into a shipping solution that we would then make available to the rest of the organization. So for us, the right knowledge transfer processes were absolutely key. We then also had to define the right KM standards. In other words, how long does an idea live for? Who has access to those ideas and the IP associated with them? And then we also had to define who are the roles, the KM roles that we were going to have in place to service the rest of this model. So we had to look carefully at the key KM competencies that we had in place, and these are some of them. Then for us, from a resourcing standpoint, we recognized that we didn't have all of the KM expertise in-house. So we did have to secure the help of other parties in our company to help us define these knowledge flow standards. We also needed to go and borrow and beg and steal because we basically come to the point that we didn't have enough money to provide for all of these different services on an ongoing basis. And we needed to update our technical platform to be able to deal with some of the new features and the knowledge flow. And to help us do that, we essentially recruited field consultants and Microsoft IT to help us build these additional services that you see in the middle there. We secured, as I mentioned previously, from executive sponsors, funding, rewards, and role modeling. And we also used our ACM team, our change management team, to help us with certain aspects of change management because we didn't have that competency in-house ourselves. And then the last key thing here, on the budget, we essentially knew and determined how much money we needed to run these cloud OpEx services. So that was a key bucket that we had to provide funding for. We also had to provide funding for people's time. In consulting, you pay for people's time. And then we had to provide funding for those awards, all of which we secured through our exec sponsors. Now that is basically a whirlwind tour through our innovation campaign KM model that we put into place after discovering our grassroots KM initiative wasn't doing fantastically. And I can say, quite honestly, the million-dollar question is, what outcomes did you get once adopting this particular approach? Well, for us, I can honestly say that before we put this into place, we only generated 6 shipping innovation products. It was not great over an 18-month period. They were only reused in 8 projects, also not fantastic. We had a reasonable active innovation community. 96 people are active, obviously lots more participating passively. And we only generated 6 innovation stories, best practices, lessons learned. In the 18 months after we put the KM model into place, we've since generated 29 shipping innovation products, as a result of hundreds of ideas, we've now reused in more than 80 projects across the company these products and services defined out of this grassroots innovation initiative. And we have more than 1,000 active community members from across the company. And we've generated 63 innovation stories that have had thousands of impressions inside and out of the company. So I can honestly say that the pattern we've put into place, for me at least, shows that KM model innovation can really materially contribute towards innovation outcomes or whatever other strategy you apply it to from your business context. So maybe in the last minute here, before we open for questions, now that you've heard this whirlwind tour, did you identify any KM blind spots that you were potentially aware of in your own company? And whilst you consider that, I'll briefly finish off by showing you how you can get started. The design process to create a KM model is design thinking based, and I can provide more information on this to you after the session if you'd like to. But the process you typically go through to design your first KM model is to do research, as you've seen, into your personas, to generate ideas on the concepts you'll be providing as your first KM models, and then to test that with those various groups. And then if that works, you then move into full-on prototyping, which you then will iterate as you are always in a state of design and production. So that's the design thinking process you go through. But if you don't have the time for that, the quickest, easiest way for you to get started is to essentially take this canvas that I'm going to provide you, go and sit down with an area of your business that you want to improve KM for, and then use these trigger questions to visualize the current state of your KM model. Work through these questions with various stakeholders in a part of your business, and that will help you identify blind spots and come up with your first KM model that you can then use to plan further enhancements and visualizations. Here's a blank version that you can use, and I really hope you enjoyed this session, and I'm now ready to take questions from you. It was created just for you in an attempt to share some of our learnings and knowledge.
Okay, hello to this presentation of how a knowledge graph became a focal point of an internal knowledge hub in a software company. My name is Andreas. I'm CEO and founder of Semantic Web Company. And today I will talk about knowledge graphs in general. I believe personally, knowledge graphs are a really great way to help people work together in a more streamlined way. Knowledge sharing is obviously really important in these days on all levels of organizations. And it's not just connecting data, really. So I think there are several knowledge graph definitions out there. Some are more focused on data integration, but we see it more holistically. We want to really help connect data, knowledge, and people all together. And by that, you can find answers to small, big, and even global problems. So I'm very passionate about that since about 20 years. Back in 2000, we founded Semantic Web Company, or a predecessor of it. And since then, the semantic web technologies have been adopted by a lot of large enterprises and is used everywhere in the meantime. So the agenda for this presentation is I'll talk you through knowledge graphs and knowledge hubs, what the difference is, how they interact with each other. We'll talk about a case study. So this is a concrete implementation of a knowledge hub project. Actually, it's our internal knowledge hub at Semantic Web Company, following the principle drink your own champagne. We've implemented a hub based on our Pool Party Semantic Suite, which is the product we ship to our customers when they want to create their own knowledge hubs. And then last but not least, we will take a quick look on further application scenarios and use cases and close with an outlook. So why are graphs needed? Why is that important for all kinds of KM strategies we see these days? I mean, it's just to start with a very simple ladder of prioritizations, there's customer satisfaction always at the end of this journey. So it could be internal, it could be external customers. If they're satisfied, there's value for all of us. And in between, to get there, you need to make a lot of decisions on different levels of your organizations, different departments, cross-departmental, external, internal stakeholders, a lot of data involved, a lot of content. So it's really crucial to have a better handle on all these kind of content and data flows, and to be able to do knowledge discovery at scale. So it shouldn't be an ad hoc knowledge sharing, knowledge management activity anymore. It should be really organized by the organization people work for. It should be an infrastructure, really. So why are we trying to do that is centered around the goal to have holistic views, comprehensive 360-degree views of all kind of core processes and business objects. So that's what we call Enterprise 360. That's the ultimate vision. And centered around that, we see several activities on a more departmental level, like Customer 360, but also Employee 360, Product and Market 360. So let me give you a couple of examples what we mean by that. So for instance, if we help customers assemble individual products into bundles to meet individual needs, that's one concrete application of what we mean by Customer 360, or also to link information from, on the one side, for instance, product features, on the other side, trends on the marketplace, or to learn from incidences and tickets from the service desk to feed that back into the product development, to staff projects with the right people, or even to link all these signals into one to have a more strategic perspective on skills management throughout the entire organization. But the reality is we have a lot of loosely coupled data silos, not linked to each other. They all have contain facts and information about the same or similar business objects, but you have to link them together rather on a manual level. So this is what knowledge work currently means. You look around and you do a data integration on your desktop, and that should be changed. And here knowledge graph technologies come into play. I mean, the question always is knowledge graphs. Is this news, or is this something we should care about? Actually, knowledge graphs have been around for a long time. They have existed and will continue to exist in every company. They were just not called knowledge graphs. And it's actually just a digitalization effort we currently see. So we want to digitize these graphs we have in our heads and how we interact with other stakeholders and knowledge assets throughout our corporations, also with external stakeholders. So we want to scale. We want to link the knowledge we have in analog form, in documents, and etc., into our digital world. That's what knowledge graphs actually is. And another frequently seen misconception is knowledge graphs. Why do we need that? We have already so much metadata. Well, but metadata alone doesn't work. It's siloed up frequently. It's just living inside the silo. If somebody is looking for data expressing an intent, it's very hard to make the connection. So because there is just no meaning outside of the silo, which can be understood by other agents, applications, and humans. So we need to make that explicit. This metadata describing our content and data needs to be expressed in a way it can be linked to other agents. So in that case, now the end user finally finds what he or she is really needing. So we need to transform metadata as currently used into interoperable metadata, which can be linked and processed by other applications and systems. This is the key also, again, for knowledge graphs. The knowledge graph is the place in which metadata can be understood by all agents outside of the silos as well. And that brings me to this transition, really. So currently we have a lot of such containers, a lot of repositories with their built-in metadata, index, terminology management, probably those systems now are currently transformed into they're not replaced, so they are really enriched by a semantic service endpoint, a platform probably, where you start creating taxonomies, where you have a concept tagging service attached and all that. And the very same semantic service platform can then be used for other content repositories at the same time. So you really split up the content and the data from the meaning of the data. So you start to create a knowledge graph as its own asset, which is then used to make sense of all the other data in your organization. So also data management and data governance is no longer happening at the same place. It's really split it into different workflows, and that's very important. So let's take a quick look on what a knowledge graph really is, so kind of the anatomy of that. So here we have an example of a person who is the CEO of a bank called Erste Group, which has, for instance, a stock ticker, which is classified as a bank. There's also a classification code attached. So this is already quite a nice little knowledge model about how people, organization, and classification can work together. You can start to link it to other repositories. You can start, and that's also key, link it to unstructured data like news articles, internal documentation, all that. And here, a very important feature of such a system is shown, which is the tagging, the concept tagging, the named entity resolution of all found important things in an unstructured data object. So here you see that already. It's linked, and by that, you can start using knowledge graphs to answer questions like, what do CEOs of banks with positive stock prices talk about? Well, they talk about debt, they talk about the corona pandemic, they talk about resilience. This would not have been possible if you would not have linked, for instance, the stock exchange rate database with the knowledge model or the news article you have seen just before. So this is how a knowledge graph makes a difference. It starts to link data from different silos into one structure, and it provides an interface to do querying, which is going beyond the simple keyword term-based search engines, as we all know. And by that, you need to come up with a couple you have to express the meaning of stuff which is found in the document. So for instance, resilience could be anything also with regards to material science, psychological resilience, urban resilience. So it has many meanings. It's ambiguous. But actually the resilience we're talking here about, this is organizational resilience. This is what's meant in that context. There's even a standard for that, what organizational resilience means. So in reality, when you start search for resilience without any context, you will end up with a wild mix of results, which do not make sense really in your given context. So you need to explain in a model more intelligently what resilience could mean. So it could be an organizational or system theory resilience, and this only is relevant for banking industry. In mathematics or psychological resilience, that's not important for them. And if you start to contextualize intent of users, of knowledge workers, you get the much better set of answers and documents returned. So this is one of the big advantages of such a structure. So in all cases, it's always about connecting content with data, people, bringing this together into one structure. And as a human, you're really good with that, but it does not scale. You have to do it manually. Because you understand that, for instance, this person is interested in machine learning. There's a document about AI techniques. The intent is about deep learning, etc. So these links can be made by ourselves, but machines are really bad with that. Also, if you start tagging, with very simple tagging, like you just put their terms on top, which are important, still it does not resolve this problem. What you really need is a semantic model, a model which makes machines understand how AI techniques, deep learning, machine learning, for instance, are connected to each other. And this is what is typically built out by using taxonomies and ontologies. So those are the two main drivers of a knowledge graph running in the background to do all these great automated steps later on. That's an example of such a model. It's based on a standard, a World Wide Web Consortium standard called SCOS, the Simple Knowledge Organization System. So here, obviously, you need tooling. You need ways to create such taxonomies and ontologies in an efficient way. So for instance, later on, if you have that in place, you can start to create links between people, projects, project descriptions, their biographies, open positions. You could build a semantic matchmaking tool. You could call that HR recommender if you like. That's one example how such knowledge models will start helping you to create a much better digital experience at your workplace, at your support desk, probably during the content creation time, at a digital experience hub situation. All those applications later on will make use of these semantic models. So you can try that out later on if you like. There's this HR recommender on the web. You find it easily via our website or on a search engine like Google. Okay, let's take a closer look at knowledge hubs and graphs. Is that the same thing? No, it's not. So the knowledge graph, the enterprise knowledge graph, EKG in short, is just the infrastructure providing the services to build on top the really cool applications like a knowledge hub. But the graph itself is not an application. It's consolidated linked data and content. And it's not replacing any of your systems. It's just adding an additional semantic layer on top of all existing repositories, if you like. So why, to sum that up, are knowledge hubs based on KGs, on knowledge graphs? So why is that interesting? First, the graphs bring together unstructured and structured data at the same time. It's the ultimate linking engine. It generates unified views, for example, Customer 360. It is also great for cross-functional, cross-departmental collaboration. It makes information accessible across the value chain. It also provides to machine learning and data ops, AI ops, data scientists a great way to access data sets to train machine learning algorithms. It's providing reusable data sets, and it really helps to break down the data silos. So it's the ultimate, actually the ultimate vision of having an enterprise 360 in place where all kind of data is linked into one knowledge hub is the only way moving forward, is starting to create knowledge graphs. Now let's take a closer look at this case study. We have started to develop a knowledge hub for the Semantic Web company as well. And I want to show you a little bit which steps we've taken, what the consequences are, which prerequisites and all that have been in place. Well, we started with identifying our challenges. So it's kind of a KM strategy we came up with. We identified on the product side a couple of things, like for instance, we have a lot of different application scenarios our users are asking for. So we have a lot of options on the one side, but also the need to explain our software very precisely. We are working on a dynamic market. We have to observe the trends, the competitors, the trends. That's an important source. And it's a challenging technology and also business environment. We are working like pharmaceutical industry, banking industry. So human resources are really key. We would, for instance, like to onboard more efficiently our new employees. So those are a couple, or actually one list of the most important challenges. And that brought us to the point that we said, okay, let's create this knowledge hub. There's, three different types of knowledge, like implicit, procedural, and conceptual knowledge. The question, of course, always is which of those you can build into a knowledge model, into a knowledge graph. To be very clear, implicit knowledge is quite hard to be kind of encoded in any digital form. So first of all, you should definitely focus on conceptual knowledge and later on procedural knowledge. And here the source is actually of our, for the Knowledge Hub. So where can we learn from? We can learn from customers, of course, also from how the product is used and the employees themselves, from our partners, etc. So in the first phase, we said, let's focus on conceptual knowledge taken from learning from the use cases we've built, learn from the colleagues, from other experts in the company, learn from users of the product, the documentation. We have a research department, they bring in a lot of input, and also market analysis from analyst firms, etc., a great source. So this was the first phase, and here are the concrete resources, for instance, our use case collection, the skills profiles we've built based on semantic models, the technical documentation, conference papers, a book, for instance, the Knowledge Graph Cookbook, collaterals of marketing, etc. So and that's the result. That's how the user interface looks like. It consists of several smart assistants like faceted search, quite an extensive type ahead feature, recommender feature, a summarization feature. You see an expert finder here. So it's really a very helpful way to interact with all these great sources we have. So to sum it up, the Knowledge Hub is now part of SWC's knowledge management initiative, very much at the core even. It provides to our employees a lot of easily to be accessed information from different sources. Technically, they do shortcuts now. They don't have to search on G Drive. They don't have to search on Confluence anymore. It's built into one interface, really. And the use cases are really quite, broad. So even as SWC, we are not a very big company, but we have different views on the same data, like product management has questions like what trends are most relevant to data architects right now. Sales would like to see, okay, where have we built maybe a solution already in the energy industry, and we've been using power tagging solution for SharePoint. So you really want to reuse existing knowledge, or marketing, of course, needs reference customers to create use cases and stories around it, etc. And then, of course, the clients, the users, they just want to have better access to the technical documentation. Well, this is the information just to list that the current state of the system. So we use G Drive, Paligo, that's our technical documentation platform. We use WordPress, Confluence, and technically spoken, you can create connectors to any of such systems easily. The more crucial part really is to set up a taxonomy and corresponding workflows and governance models, which allow to do that at scale and in the long run. So this is really one of the challenges typically organizations face when they start creating a knowledge graph and the knowledge hub on top. Just to make sure, again, knowledge graph is not the hub, it's a service. And on top of the graph, we've built actually already 3 different applications. So the one is the internal knowledge hub. Then there's also a search over documentation, currently in beta, so it's not on the web yet, but that's the next release, next step. And also the search on the website is underway, which is going to be dramatically improved now with the knowledge graph under the hood. So it's really driving different applications, and it's just one infrastructure, one service layer, so to speak, using the same semantic model again and again. That's the high-level system architecture again. So here, or not again, but now in more in detail, so it's illustrating in a more detailed version of what I've shown you before. So here's the enterprise knowledge graph sitting, so to speak, in the middle. It's the semantic middleware using our very own semantic suite, the pool party semantic suite. And it's creating connection to all different sources where, for instance, the collaterals are found, the analyst reports probably. And here we start to ingest that kind of data. We create with the extractor in place based on our domain taxonomies, a consistent metadata layer, which is embedded in the model. So it's really providing linked metadata, not just linear metadata. which is later on used by the recommender service, by the faceted search, and by the type ahead feature, for instance. At the very core, we also use a graph database to provide the services for the visualization on top, like our graph search application or the enhanced feature, search feature for Polygo, etc. So this is the middleware sitting on top of the existing repositories, providing this unified semantic layer, providing the service endpoints to enrich the applications on top. And then you can also take a closer look at how this modeling environment looks like. Typically, we have at least a two-tier system in place, a staging server on which the modeling takes place, where the ingestion of the data happens. We have a production server in place, could be clustered then also. And here, the actual applications then consume the data from here. There's a synchronization in place, and this is how the minimum, let's say, viable environment looks like in productive systems. So again, let's take a closer look at what is provided by this application in terms of better user experience. So the faceted search is very precise. So all this facet values are stemmed from the controlled vocabulary, from a taxonomy, so they're not randomly or statistically calculated. They're highly precise and helpful by that. You can also produce a hierarchical faceted search even, which is then always including all the sub-concepts automatically, which is very helpful for people, for instance, getting onboarded. They probably know machine learning, but they don't know all these variants of machine learning. So they just click on machine learning, still find documents not talking about ML explicitly, but maybe deep learning. So this is one of the most important features. Then there's, that's the tree, as you can switch between tree and list if you like on that user interface. There is the integrated recommender system. So any document you find is actually a node in the knowledge graph, and then it's starting to calculate, are there any related documents, maybe taken from other repositories. So you really start search cross-departmental, cross silo, and you also find out who are the people I should talk to when I'm interested in this particular use case, for instance. Then there's a smart autocomplete. You see there's a lot of context provided to the people. If you just search for graph, you see instantly, okay, is this more a data asset? Is it a technology? Is it a product component, etc.? So this is highly accurate and helpful, obviously, and drives a lot the generation of precise search intent formulation. So how to build that? How to build a knowledge graph and then the hub on top? So how does the process look like? In short, this is an overview here. Typically, the different ways to trigger the process, start to create first taxonomies. There could be an import of existing taxonomies. We have pre-built industry standard taxonomies. You can harvest from other linked data sources. We do corpus analysis a lot. That means we make sure taxonomies are really reflecting the actual underlying content and data sets. And then you start to enrich taxonomies with ontology layers that also drives later on the mapping and also the filtering out of assets. So the ontology are very important later on to have a knowledge graph in place, which is precise. For instance, when you start to map your data from different, for instance, relational or CSV, JSON objects, you need taxonomies and ontologies at the same time. Taxonomies are really great to go down to the entity level and extract concepts highly accurate. You can automate those steps with the pool party unified views component. And as a result, you have the knowledge graph then in place as a service, clustered, high availability, enterprise ready, and on top you have the hub itself. So this typically the most crucial part of that is you need to have ways to efficiently do the knowledge modeling, and it's not done just once. Of course, you get up to speed quickly with pool party typically. You create the first version of the models after a couple of typically weeks, yeah, and then you can already provide a first version of your knowledge hub on top. But then you start to collect input from users, maybe also search log files, other ways to just fetch information from users to create an even better version of the taxonomy. Plus, the ongoing corpus analysis is a very important step. And at the same time, you create a governance model for that. So it's really important to think about how the organizational environment is going to accept this new layer, this new way to describe the meaning of metadata. So for instance, you need to define guiding principles for the process governance. You determine members of maybe of a governance council. You have to define different roles, who is responsible, what is good quality, who is determining when a new release is provided, etc. So this is, of course, then influencing the actual knowledge model development process, which, for instance, is driven by, the analysis of the domain itself. You need to obtain stakeholder input. So it's a collaborative effort typically. And after several iterations, you have refined your governance model, and also by that, the modeling process again and again. So it's going to stabilize after a while, and then you have really typically a greatly running system in place, which is then again and again providing new releases of your knowledge hub. So that's another way to look at it, the modeling workflows at a glance. You have a modeling server, you have a production server. This is driving the auto tagging. This is driving this semantic footprinting of the different knowledge objects, which is then influencing the search. And here's the input back to the knowledge worker or taken from the AI component like corpus learning. So this is, you see, highly collaborative. There's typically knowledge specialists included, like taxonomists. And those are working with the domain experts and the knowledge workers, the users themselves, and they are kind of rapid, or let's say continuously trying to update and create new versions of the underlying taxonomies and ontologies. And that's a screenshot of the pool party Tesoro server. So this is kind of the interface taxonomists work with. It's based on the SCOS model. That's the standard for that. You have a way to retrieve concepts here from the tree. You can take a look at it, like, for instance, the different labels. The synonyms are maintained within this interface. You can create relations to other concepts across hierarchies. You have broader concepts, you have narrower concepts. So this is really the basic stuff, but that's already very important. If that's done correctly, then this will mean a lot later when it comes to text mining and search on top. And that's the automatization component, unified views. Pool party can connect to different repositories and then do a lot of steps in between before it's getting published and linked. So you can do validation, transformation, enrichment, and stuff like that. And this is typically done in this is kind of ETL style, where you create such processing pipelines and then execute them on a scheduled basis, monitor them, and so on. So that's the overview of the entire platform, which is under the hood of our Knowledge Hub, the pool party platform, consisting of the graph management components, the text mining and entity and concept extraction components, the automation component, and the visualization and application development layer on top, which is called graph search. And typically, you really have to think in those along these lines. You won't fly instantly. So everyone is asking for a knowledge hub, enterprise 360, and all that. Well, you have to build the foundation first. You have to crawl. You have to build the taxonomies, ontologies, identify content types and structure. You start to walk on top of that. You will get very precise with your way to let your machines understand your data. You will build, and by that run, applications on top first, applications like a semantic search engine for a particular part of your content, for instance, maybe even a question answering engine but you only will fly and create this knowledge hub after a while. And this is also important. Don't boil the ocean. Don't dream of flying without having learned the other things before. So what's the outlook in phase 2? We want to add more procedural knowledge. We want to add more resources, for instance, our partner information. We want to learn from that. We want to include the incidents from our support desk, for instance, to better understand what could be picked up from our customers in terms of learn from them, how to make use of our software. And in phase 3, we definitely want to build out a more question answering interfaces. Q&A is a really great way to show the power of knowledge graphs. They can do very well, very precisely, and they really scale nicely. We have a couple of Q&A applications already built. There's one demo also available on the web. Please take a look at that to see how that works. And there are, of course, even more use cases for knowledge hubs. Our customer in Australia, the Health Direct Australia, is a great example of how knowledge hubs at scale can be built for an entire domain. So all kind of health information for Australian citizens are provided in form of a knowledge hub. Go to Health Direct Australia, please, and take a look at it. Under the hood, there's quite a great knowledge graph. Or customers from management consultancy use this kind of technology to help staff projects with skilled people, with the right people, also to detect gaps in the skill space, for instance. So that's again brings me back to this matchmaking tool. It's kind of a prototype for this kind of application you can take a look at on the web. Or in pharmaceutical industry, knowledge hubs can help, for instance, in very business critical processes like drug approval. So here we really need to be quick, we need to be precise, we need to understand where are the content gaps, what do we provide to the, for instance, FDA, what information is provided and what could probably be used to slow down the process then? Where do we have any kind of contradictions? Who can help me in this process? Where are the similar questions we have already answered already before? I should take a look at. So here, knowledge graphs are key to be more precise and drive this process in a better direction. Or corporate learning. So we can help with knowledge graphs also to enhance learning environments, to help people to find learning objects which really fill in the gaps of the career path, which fit to the already developed skills in a way. So here a knowledge graph is helping to gather information from different learning repositories and bring that into one spot. Or even in wildlife and nature conservation, we've been able to help already. So there are systems which help to detect some kind of activities in, for instance, national parks across Africa, where we would like to be quickly at the right place to help prevent accidents and hazardous activities which harm the lives of these beautiful animals. And therefore we need data. We need a lot of data that's collected, but the more you link it together, you can understand where a next possible activity could be and preserve by that nature and wildlife across the globe. So that's a project we've done together with Sensing Clues. Maybe you're interested in that as well. Well, to sum up also, or as a follow-up, please make sure to download our white paper. It talks a lot about what I've shown you now, more in detail. So this is one of the key aspects. You dramatically improve text mining and NLP with knowledge graphs in place. If you want to take a closer look at the big picture, there's the knowledge graph cookbook. There's also a free PDF for that, paperback, if you like, on Amazon. And last but not least, of course, I would be more than happy to talk you through more of the use cases and details. As you have seen, very passionate about knowledge graphs and those technologies. I'm on LinkedIn. Please let's make sure if you're interested in this topic, let's talk. And thanks a lot. I hope it was interesting for you. Bye-bye.
Everybody's here. Hello, everyone. We are on to our next session, the panel, which is knowledge management in the hybrid work environment. So we have we have Robin also joining us. So Nick is the moderator, so I'll leave it to Nick to take it from here. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Deirdre. Hi, everybody. So I'm here with Helmut and Dave. Dave and I, you've met already in this conference. Helmut is a colleague of Andreas, who was the last speaker. And and Robin's joining us. You've met Robin already. We will be very interested to talk as a panel in answer to your questions on the topic of knowledge management in the hybrid work environment. And I think hi there, Robin. Nice to have you back. I think I'll start off with a general question to the three of you. Do we know how to make KM work in a hybrid work environment? Helmut, what do you think?
I would say that's a general topic. To get KM to work in the hybrid environment doesn't make it easier. Yeah. But on the other hand, I think we have been never set up better from tools, from what we learned, from experience to tackle them. Yeah. So, and we learned over the last 2 years that we have to change things.
What do you think, David? Do you think we know how to make it work?
I mean, most of us have been working in hybrid environments for 3 or 4 decades now. I mean, you kind of like forget that. I mean, and for Christ's sake, we were doing it in IBM with hosts, with green screens and, piping about dwarfs throwing axes. Sorry, I wasn't meant to be playing games, all right? So, working in a virtual environment, a hybrid environment, has just been a part and parcel. I mean, I've run a small company since I left IBM. We've got staff on 4 continents, and we have to find ways to do that. Yeah, and I think people who've been doing that for years know there's a huge difference between physical and virtual, and there's some science behind that. I mean, we know that human communication is far more than oral and visual. It's chemicals actually, or scent is a key part of determining trust in human communication. So I think what COVID did is it gave us a period without any physical interaction. Right? And I think that allowed us to swing the pendulum a bit and realize that a lot of meetings were taking place which didn't take place. But I think it also increased the intensity of realizing what we were missing. So I ran the first big workshop the other day for one of the big farmers. And we did manage a mixed hybrid physical sub-workshop group. But the whole level of communication, the back conversations, the conversations in the corridors, the chatting as people were leaving, all of that sort of stuff came back and hugely enriched the environment. And we use technology to augment it. So I think it's an issue about balance. It's also an issue about equity. It's an issue about trust. I think it's really focused on trust issues. I think, to be quite honest, a lot of the tech companies, and sorry about this, Robin, but Microsoft are one of the offenders here, starting to issue tools which allow you to monitor people's performance when they're working virtually. If I had my way, I'd ban those because they're the actual opposite of what KM and work is meant to be about these days. So there's some quite nasty little things creeping into the virtual environment around productivity, which we could do without. But overall, it's balance and understanding. And what I say to people, you need multiple tools. You should never be in a single tool environment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we use HubSpot, we use Slack, we use Zoom, We'll use Teams if we're forced to, but that means we have to go into Google and the computers fall over more frequently, but we use Teams because a lot of our clients use Teams, that's fine. So it's this multi-tool, multi-vendor, multi-environment. Be flexible, know when to get together, when not together. I think that's the sort of fluidity we're much more used to these days.
Okay, Robin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the size company you have. I think if you're in a smaller company, knowledge management or knowledge transfer typically takes place more easily, whether it's remote or in person. I think to make things work better in hybrid environments in large companies, I think communities of practice are amazing things to put into place. I mean, it comes back to what Dave said earlier about growing informal networks, about knowing who has knowledge that you can access. And communities of practice are an amazing way to actually do that. Also, back to your book, Nick, I think I read your book, and I think one of the things you said in there was relationships was a kind of knowledge that you would look at needing to manage. So for me personally, I think communities of practice is a really powerful thing to emphasize even more in hybrid environments than before in big companies.
Yeah, great. Yes, and as you say, depending on the size, because yeah. David, you mentioned corridor conversations, and we've also got a question from Anton about replacing the conversations in corridors. Now, I don't know if you gentlemen read a post recently. It was in April by Nancy Dixon talking about hallways and corridors as a metaphor for the places where knowledge gets shared. She talked about team rooms or team space where teams gather knowledge. She talked about the hallways and the corridors being where the knowledge is informally shared between teams. And she talked about the storerooms, which collects the output of that sense making. And talking, of course, of corridors and hallways as a metaphor for that sort of interstitial space where the cross-team interaction happens. Where do you think, and we'll start with you, Robin, where do you think the corridors and the hallways are in a hybrid world?
May I interrupt 1 minute, Nick, please?
Yeah.
We have a fifth panelist here, Stephen Kennedy from eGain.
Stephen, good to have you on board.
I'll leave you now.
Thanks.
Well, we have noticed him, dear. He just appeared.
Welcome.
I apologize for the tardiness there, guys.
No worries at all. Right, so you've got the question, Stephen, but we'll let Robin answer. Where do you think the corridors and the hallways are in the virtual environment?
Look, we've just, in my team, we haven't seen each other physically for 2 years. We do have what we call coffee and cocktails that we basically had arranged virtually to happen every week.
Sounds like Downing Street.
No agenda, and coffee and cocktails because it was coffee on one side of the world in the morning and cocktails on the other side in the evening. And that really helped. No agenda. Typically managers wouldn't even go to those. And that really got people talking about how they feel, getting to know each other better. But I must be honest with you, we had then a physical team meeting. We hadn't seen each other in 2 years, spent a few days together. There's no substitute for in-person meeting. And that's what I can really say that I've discovered over the last 2 years. I thought hybrid, you could make it work as well as in person, but no.
Yeah.
So
I think the other interesting thing, Nick, is that the equivalent and I love Nancy for, Nancy is terribly naive about technology and people having conversations with each other, right? And it's an absolute delight. But she's never survived a large corporation like IBM, and life is a little bit different, right? Your problem with the virtual equivalent of the corridor chats, it's people having side chats open. We used to do this in IBM, and we used to turn irony on and off with HTML code just to upset IBM vice presidents because they didn't know what we were doing to them. But in the modern environment, people are aware that people are doing other things in parallel to the conversation and aware that they're having other conversations in parallel. And I think that's actually producing quite a chilling effect in a virtual environment. And I would say generally, every time I see a conference platform, and this is one, which tries to replicate a physical environment in a virtual environment, I say, you guys need some better designers. because virtual environments need to look very different from physical environments.
Yeah.
You can't replicate one with the other. And BT were making that mistake in the 1980s and it didn't work. And nobody's really advanced since then.
Yeah,
that is very true.
Stephen,
Yeah.
sorry.
No worries. I think that whole concept, and Rob and I do agree with you. We did exactly the same thing. We had a no agenda meeting where we could just go and have a discussion with people, but it is by no means the same, anywhere near as that meeting in a physical environment in any way, shape, or form. I know that when we had a chance to get things lifted, and we were unable to have, I live in the UK, so we had the opportunity to have more than 6 people in the house at the same time. We basically gathered 6 people from the teams together, and we would have pocket meetings where they would come to a house and they would socialize a lot more along the work line, and we would sit and work together as an alternative to going into a full-blown office. And I think that progressed us, or it kept us alive as a team so much more than what it has done. But Dave, I agree with you. That whole concept of digital versus reality, you have to have something that looks completely different.
Yeah, Stephen and Robin, I think those are great examples, but they're still in the team context. Your team coffee and cocktails, and Stephen, your team parties. Helmut, what about the cross-team corridor talk? How do we get the conversation going between those silos?
Just the observation before, because you stated also in smaller companies it's easier, in bigger companies community practice health, which means basically making big companies smaller, right?
Good, making big companies smaller. I like it.
Yeah. And I mean, for us, I mean, we're a smaller company, and I think we had the same things, that we tried to have these coffee meetings where then nobody showed up, because that's also a fact of this remote conversation where you really focus only on work and not on the things that are not related. I mean, I have also the feeling sometimes it's a bit generation thing, because we know that I'm not a gamer at all, so I don't know that world at all, but I know that people meet there in virtual environments and have fun. I'm not sure how that works, but somehow I have the feeling that could be transferred also into a working environment, because when it works there, why not here? Yeah. But still, it will not fully replace physical.
No.
Just to throw something in here, I mean, if there's an equivalent. If you look at something like the myths about the singularity, right? The idea that we can transport ourselves into a computer. And there was a big conference on the West Coast, and I didn't know Kurzweil was in the front seat, but never mind. And I said, anybody who believes that, their mind is ossified to the point where for them it may be possible. And I would say this, he got a bit upset about that, but I think the same applies here, right? If you genuinely believe that you can have the same level of social interaction in a virtual environment with cocktails and stuff like that, I mean, it's better to do it than not do it. Yep. Then you've denigrated human communication and human interaction at a high level of impoverishment.
But Dave, think about our daughters and granddaughters and sons. You know, they're using TikTok and Instagram Live. And, you know what I mean?
It scares the shit out of me, because I know about epigenetics, all right?
That's integrating connectivity.
If you look at epigenetics and material engagement theory, our grandchildren may lose the capacity to understand when to trust people and when not to trust people.
Very
if
much
you
so.
spent the amount of time I do looking at the way strange attractors work in social media to corrupt people's thinking, I would be worried about that. I think you need to move people back into physical environments really urgently.
Interesting.
Can
I sort of move us on a little bit? There's various questions coming in. I'd like to raise one by Hamish Tracy, which is picking up on what you were saying, Robin, about communities of practice. How can we create, I mean, I'm going to read Hamish's question because I think he's answered it in his own question. He says, how can we create communities of practice in remote work? It's been so hard for us to implement this concept without key personnel who take ownership and leadership on a knowledge topic. Are there strategies or ways to implement communities of practice that you can recommend? I think, Hamish, that concept of ownership and leadership on a knowledge topic is probably a key part of the answer. But What do the rest of you think? Helmut?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same way we try now, which is a bit. I would not have a good idea here, yeah, for the hybrid one. I mean, again, for me, also knowledge management is not just drinking beers together and talk, right? It's also about collecting information, collecting knowledge, and sharing that, yeah. And for that, I could say yes, of course, we can create communities of practice where people can share information, collect information, collaboratively work. There are really tools to augment that, yeah. And then we can try to facilitate that communication in meetings, yeah, that work as good as we know, yeah. So that's the way how it can work now, yeah.
Okay.
I think from a Microsoft standpoint, yeah, because we're a large corporate, we've been experimenting with communities of practice for about 13 years. And I think the three things that I've come to learn, about large global communities that are virtual, is that if you want that community to be vibrant and live, firstly, you should make sure that you are very careful about the kind of communities you create. I think that the community should be strategically relevant to the company, so that it gets invested in terms of resources and program management. Then I think it needs to be very, very closely tied to members' passions, things that people are super interested about. And then the third dimension is really about the lifespan. I mean, the community should be able to live past 3 or 4 years. Like in our context, if I wanted to create a Windows 95 community, I don't think I'd get any members. It's not relevant to my company, and it's dead. So I think those three things are some of the things that I'd look at. And then you need a really amazing community champion to start it all off, a person who's going to automatically go out there and connect people and drive community engagement. I think those things might help.
Yeah, I do. I'm picking up on what David said earlier about this is not new. None of this is new.
Correct.
I think one of the things that we can do is look to the multinationals and look to the very dispersed organizations who interact remotely and have done for decades, and the models they use. David, what do you think?
You've got to be really careful on this, all right? I mean, one of the things we did, and this also relates to your survey as well, Nick, is you can't trust what knowledge management people say about knowledge management. You really can't trust it because they're generally highly illusional. So we actually did field ethnography with the big four of the big five consultancy firms over 2 weeks. We put in deep ethnographers and we studied what actually happened around their communities of practice. And it bore no relationship whatsoever to the design or what their chief knowledge officers said. What we actually found is that people found it to find somebody to phone up and have a conversation with. Because they needed that human search validation of what was actually going on. So the practice didn't correspond. I mean, you could see it in the stats. And if you go back to Etienne's original work on communities of practice, where this all comes from was one study of one engineering company in one specific context. So he took the output of a 10-year evolutionary process and translated it into a recipe. And knowledge management has been copying that recipe ever since. And it sort of works for the first year or so on a Hawthorne effect, then it fails. And people don't look at the underlying principles of community of practice design, which is what level of abstraction, what level of codification, what level of diffusion, what level of engagement. And it's much more effective to stimulate informal networks and make the informal ones that you want to be formal, than try and design the formal ones in the first place. So creating an ecosystem in which people can choose their own tools and their interaction, stimulate that ecosystem, and as patterns start to form, formalize it, is a much more effective approach than trying to design the perfect system up front, which is what KM keeps trying to do.
Dave, I would agree with you there because we've seen it when new cities are being built. I mean, there's not many that get now. Instead of laying down the paths that the city planners think should be there, they leave it to the citizens to actually create their own paths. Once their paths are created, then they go and formalize them by cementing them, by making them better, and by making them easier. So there should be that design thought process whenever you are starting out, that you need to give people the flexibility and the freedom.
It's fascinating the way that architects can't cope with that. So I was involved in 3 knowledge projects. All right, we did a knowledge-based design to feed architecture, and one worked really well. The one we did for SmithKline Beecham outside Heathrow, and we ended up with clerks being given offices and executives being put in open plan. Because when we actually looked at it, the walls of the office were part of the clerk's extended cognition. They put charts and things up on it. They needed quiet, whereas actually executives needed to overhear gossip. That was actually part of what they needed to do on connection. But then you look at the British Aerospace building, the British Airways building, or the Royal Bank of Scotland building, and I worked on both. And the architect decides in advance how they feel people should collaborate, and they build a space around it. So they did it in the British Airways building, and then people started to put posters on walls and do things the architect hadn't designed. And he went absolutely ballistic and got the CEO to come in and rip everything off the walls and tell them how they should work together, and wondered why it went wrong, right? So the design myth, the I know better than the people, and this feeds off your point about the city. You need to create things and see how people use them and stabilize the good things and disrupt the bad ones, rather than trying to design in advance everything based on an idealized outcome. It's the classic management science mistake of the last 40 years, is to start with where you want to be rather than starting with where you are.
Yep.
Okay.
Maybe
Good.
one thing to add after the discussion also on that topic, what we can do to create community of practice in remote network environments is to give people context to their work and what is relevant for them, what people would be relevant for them, because also that can trigger communication, and can trigger new paths that are taken. And that's maybe even something that is sometimes not possible in informal, because informal also, from my perspective at least, tends to always be in the same group, and not go outside, because you never really know who is outside. And I think there are things that can help here to get this context and establish that together, even as a community of practice. That is something I would add.
Okay. Now I'm going to pick up something from Rita Prinsloo, about what hybrid workers want from the office. And the suggestion is, I think this has come from a discussion, that they want spaces for hybrid collaboration. They want single-person enclaves for hybrid meetings. They want privacy. They want enclosed workstations. I mean, what should we be doing with the work environment, the physical work environment, to enable hybrid work and to enable knowledge sharing in hybrid organizations? Have you any thoughts on that, gentlemen?
Just to be very clear, I know that one. That was a survey created by an office design consultancy firm to sell their bloody services. I mean, anybody who says research shows should be taken out and garroted for the sake of humanity unless they give a proper citation to go with it, right?
Yeah, it's like the 9 out of 10 cats, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this sort of, and it's the whole basis of things like pseudosciences like Myers-Briggs. They conduct a highly biased survey based on a limited sample and claim objectivity for it, all right? I think there's things in that, all right? Safe work environments is key. So although my bloody MacBook is playing up at the moment, I'm sitting looking out of the window on a garden with fields behind me, and I can walk into the kitchen and I can go and sit in the sitting room or sit outside. That's completely different from somebody trying to work at home in a tower block, without any natural light. And I think we need to get real about this in terms of, it's not just about ticking boxes on safety, it's about the wider ecosystem of where you work. And all the issue about rural workstations, offices to work. I mean, we've had remote workers for years. They've all ended up getting space in one of the sort of rental units so they can have other people to talk with. And so the work environment was different. And I remember when IBM made my sister work at home, she was a systems programmer. she couldn't cope with it, so she ended up converting her spare bedroom to an office, which meant I didn't have anywhere to stay anymore. And every morning she'd get up, dress into work clothes, walk around the block, walk back into the office, not leave it until the end of the day, because she needed that ritual, of separating work from home and from practice. So I think it's an ecosystem. You need to make different things available to different people and be very fluid about the way people work, rather than the one size fits all, and also allow for that to change in different times and different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Robin, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, one of the things that I don't like that has become a big trend over the last 6 to 7 years is open plan spaces. I think that's one thing. It might foster people meeting each other by chance, but it interrupts with the flow of knowledge. So I don't like that. One of the things, speaking back to what you said, we did a survey, I think just after, about 6 months after COVID started, and we saw that 80% respondents now had to work at home. They were in offices, now they had to work at home. So the single biggest impediment to them was having a tiny little space to work at home, having the right printers, devices, lighting. I think that whole home environment guidance for that is absolutely key. Maybe that's normal now, but I remember that survey said, and you start to think about that as well.
Stephen, what do you think about the hybrid environment?
So I think the hybrid environment needs to be that. It needs to be both at home and work. You need to give that flexibility to define, well, here's a little place that you can go and have your private meeting. That's not the point of coming to an office. The point of coming to an office is so that you can be with other people. Quite often, I think ideas, thoughts, and good thoughts are created when we are talking to people, not necessarily about what it is that we're trying to develop from a process perspective. Sometimes it's just that human interaction that we have, which makes the creative juices actually flow. And I think that's key to that hybrid environment, that ability to be in the office for a meeting, a large meeting or a small meeting, whatever the case is. Or if you need that quiet area that you can actually do something, office space, for example. Let's be honest, not all of us have houses. I'm lucky at where I work. I look out onto the garden.
Oops, he's gone.
Oops.
If it was about to say golf course, maybe something just came through the window.
Maybe it did.
I have no windows,
okay.
So I know what that's like.
No windows.
In my little
that's tough.
Home,
sorry, Stephen. We lost you for a moment, Stephen.
Yeah, my system just said, you're not required anymore. Rejoin. Oh, the joys of virtual meetings.
Indeed. Now, talking of virtual meetings, how do we make sure that there isn't a sort of, how should we say, a sort of two levels going on? How do we make sure that people interacting in the room interact with the people who are joining virtually to the same level? Is that even possible? And if it is, how do we do it?
I don't think that is possible, primarily because you've got such a distinctively different environment. I mean, as we've gone back into the office ourselves and I look at how we run our team meetings, we've got some of the team in the office, we've got some of them on the screen, and it's quite difficult to get that engagement, same level of engagement. You've got people doing other things, especially not related in the same meeting room. And that is going to probably be one of the most difficult things we face with the hybrid model, is to ensure that we have that engagement both virtually as well as from a locale perspective. You know, our rooms have got to change from an equipment perspective. They've got to be good quality. They've got to be, high quality sound capable. You've got to have decent video capabilities as well. But then you think about your AV projection. If you're writing on a whiteboard, a team member who's virtual cannot get engaged in that writing on the whiteboard because it just doesn't exist anyway. There is no marrying of the two devices together effectively.
Mm-hmm. David, your thoughts?
I think you have to give up on it. I think you have to realize virtual environments work differently. And actually, in many ways, they're often better asynchronously rather than synchronously. It's no coincidence people start to do things in parallel when on the chat, because actually we can manage that. It's quite easy. I mean, I've sat through a whole bunch of extremely boring discussions and cleared email, and we've all done that at some stage, not to mention have a few fights on social media. So I think you need to get this stuff focused. What's there for what, right? And smaller groups. It's like the old problem on copying everybody on your email. Yeah, which is normally a sort of ass covering exercise. I mean, I had a former boss who had a standard sign out: is if I don't specifically say yes, then don't assume consent or knowledge, because everybody copied him continuously so that they could say he'd been aware of it. And I think you've got the modern equivalent on virtual. It's like when, let's give a completely different example. When I was first a manager, I had a secretary. I spent half an hour every day sorting out the mail, dictating some stuff. She could do it better than I could anyway because she had better grammar, and spent the rest of the day managing the bloody business. And when I did a survey on IBM people recently, just before I left, general managers spent 80% of their time online responding to emails and authorizing expenditures. So you make a technology available, and people, it's almost like activity floods in to fill the opportunities presented, even if it's the wrong thing to do. Mm-hmm. Hey, it's fascinating in IBM. The more senior you were, the more you had to employ junior people to do the work you were meant to be doing.
Yeah. Any more thoughts on this engagement question, Helmut? And
yeah, I would. I mean, that's not from me. That's from the Pocket Guide for Remote Meeting Facilitators, and that's equal opportunity to safety. Yeah, and that means for mixed meetings in the end, it's still also in the room, everyone sits at the laptop to have equal opportunity, and that you cannot use whiteboards, but have to use mirror boards or something. But then you can have a full remote meeting also.
No, but mirror boards are tedious beyond belief, all right? I mean, we did one the other day.
Quite well.
I had 50 R&D scientists, all right? In 15 minutes, I had everything clustered for AI challenges in a physical environment with stuff moving around on tables. That would have taken about 3 hours on the mirror board. Yeah.
Yeah. It just doesn't work. It's a good solution. I just wanted to say, if you want to strictly do it, that's how you have to do it.
Yeah.
Added to it, Miro. Sorry, I need to be careful here because we're working on this. One of the problems with Miro is it tries to replicate the physical environment, and I'll keep coming back to that. If you ever get a chance, look at the stuff that Wendy's group did in Hawthorne Labs in IBM for Lotus. They looked at how do you create a virtual collaboration space. And it was absolutely brilliant, all right? Because it was simply a symbolic set of spaces which moved around based on what you were doing. So the representation didn't represent the meeting room. It actually represented your interactions, and you could change those interactions and feedback on it. And I couldn't get them to move it into Lotus Notes. Otherwise, that would have transformed Notes, because they wanted to keep it in the labs so they could write papers for CHI conferences. But really good UX design for a virtual environment. Look at Battlefield simulation. It uses symbols. It doesn't use replication of the physical space. So the whole issue about semiotics and aesthetics is key in UX design for virtual collaboration, and very few people are doing it. Semiotics is a much underestimated knowledge management skill. Very few people have got it, but it's really important for knowledge management.
Okay. So I think one of the messages that's coming across through all of this is choosing the right tools, knowing why you're meeting, using the tools that suit that meeting, and you can't. There's no one size fits all.
Sorry, Nick, just to qualify it,
yeah.
Not choosing tools, but making tools available.
Making tools
IT
available.
departments have this terrible habit of not allowing users. It's like they all want them to drive, grey-coloured Ford Mondeos to work, because then they can control the environment. The reality is different people have different styles, and different collaboration tools work for different people. And you shouldn't be restricting use. You should be seeing the patterns in use and then going negotiating better deals for the things that people want to use rather than forcing the procurement. We had that with one company recently. They spent 3 years procuring an ideas generation system, all right? And it's a classic, put things on a form, everybody votes on it, smiley faces, it's been around for centuries, nobody really wants it, all right? But we had to position something as a research tool, not a brainstorming tool, to get around IT procurement, despite the fact it wouldn't do what was required. Because IT needed to prove that they'd done the right thing. You know? And if you want a Windows 95 user group, just go to the NHS. There's loads of them still there, so you can probably make a sense of income on that one.
Very good.
Nick and everyone, I need to stop you now because we've run out of time. And the next session is Ron Young's workshop. And so people need to register on Zoom and get onto it. But I think that was, I wouldn't say hilarious, but very, very open and a discussion that was very important too.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you again.
Thanks very much.
Great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.